The stagecoach set her down at the edge of a dirt road just past noon, and Evelyn Hart stood there for a moment with her hand shading her eyes against the September sun, trying to get her bearings. She had been traveling for 7 days. 7 days of cramped wooden seats and wheels that found every rock and rut in every road between St. Louis and the Montana Territory. Her back ached in places she hadn't known could ache. Her dress, the blue one she'd pressed carefully the morning she left, the one she'd chosen because it was practical and not too fine and wouldn't make her look like she was trying too hard, was wrinkled beyond saving, dusted with the red earth of 3 different territories. Her hair had come half loose from its pins somewhere around the second day, and she'd stopped fighting it. She had not slept well, not once, not really. Because every time she'd closed her eyes on that rattling coach, she'd thought about the letter. Miss Hart, I have been corresponding with your situation through Mrs. Alderman's arrangement service, and I believe we may be well suited. I am a rancher in the Montana Territory with a good parcel of land and a house that needs a woman's management. I am plain-spoken and not given to pretense. If you are the same, I think we can come to an agreeable arrangement. I would ask you to come as soon as the season allows. Caleb Mercer, plain-spoken. Not given to pretense. She'd read those 2 lines more times than she could count, and each time she'd thought, that's what I need. Someone who says what he means. Someone who won't look at her round face and her broad hips and her unremarkable brown hair and make a list of everything she wasn't and hand it back to her like a bill of complaint. She'd had enough of that in St. Louis. Enough of drawing rooms where women like Evelyn Hart stood at the edges of rooms and watched other women get chosen and smiled and said nothing and went home to small apartments above other people's lives. She was 31 years old. She was not pretty in the way that stopped men in the street. She was sensible and capable, and she had a stubbornness in her that she usually kept quiet because it made people uncomfortable. She had been told more than once that she was a great deal of trouble for someone with so few obvious advantages. Caleb Mercer's letter had felt like a door cracking open. So she'd come. She asked the stagecoach driver where the Mercer Ranch was, and he pointed up the road, 2 miles, maybe 2.5, big gate with a weather vane shaped like a horse. She thanked him and started walking because there was no one there to meet her, and she wasn't going to stand in the road waiting for a man who hadn't thought to arrange a pickup. She told herself it was fine. He was a busy man. Ranchers were busy. She'd said in her last letter that she could manage herself. It was fine. Barren. She smelled the ranch before she saw it. Wood smoke and horses, and the faint sweetness of cut hay drying in the afternoon sun. Then the gate appeared, the iron weather vane horse turning lazily in a light breeze, and she walked through it and up a hard-packed dirt path toward a house that was larger than she'd expected. A proper 2-story structure, not a homesteader's shack. Whitewash on the boards, though it had been a few years since anyone had touched it up. A porch running the length of the front. 3 horses and a corral to the left. A barn behind. There were people on the porch. That was the first thing that made her steps slow, just slightly. Not one man waiting for her, but a small gathering. 2 other men she didn't recognize. A woman in an apron wiping her hands on a rag, and a boy of maybe 14 leaning against the porch railing with the easy authority of someone who lived there. The man in the center she recognized from the photograph Mrs. Alderman had sent. Caleb Mercer was perhaps 40, lean, weathered, with a face that had been outdoors for most of its life. He was not unhandsome. He had the kind of looks that came from hard work and hard weather, angular and sun-darkened, with pale eyes that were already fixed on her as she came up the path. She'd practiced this moment. She knew she had. She'd composed herself in her mind 100 times on that coach. Walk forward, introduce yourself, be direct, don't apologize for how you look. She'd promised herself she wouldn't flinch. She didn't flinch. She walked up to the porch steps and she looked Caleb Mercer in the eye and she said, "Mr. Mercer, I'm Evelyn Hart. I apologize for the state of my dress. It was a long road." He looked at her. Not the way a man looks at a woman he's glad to see. The way a man looks at something he's trying to assess. A horse, a piece of land, a deal he's not sure about. His pale eyes moved over her, unhurried, and she felt the blood rise in her face even though she'd promised herself she wouldn't let it. "Miss Hart," he said. His voice was exactly what she'd expected, flat and economical, no welcome in it. There was a pause that was a beat too long. One of the other men on the porch shifted his weight. The woman in the apron had gone very still. "You look different than I expected," Caleb said. She kept her chin level. "I've been traveling for a week. I expect I look considerably different than I would under ordinary circumstances." "No." He shook his head, and something in the way he did it made her stomach drop. "That's not what I mean." He came down the 2 steps off the porch and stopped in front of her. Up close, he was taller than she'd registered, and there was something in his face, not cruelty exactly, but a particular kind of bluntness that didn't concern itself with the feelings of other people. She'd met men like this before, men who thought honesty was a license to be unkind. "Mrs. Alderman's letter said you were a healthy woman of childbearing age," he said. He said it the way someone might say the property line is 200 yards east of the creek. A fact. A relevant fact. "She said you had no complications." Evelyn's hands, which had been loose at her sides, went still. "I had a conversation with Doc Hartwell in town last month," Caleb continued. "He's examined women in similar situations. He says there are conditions, things that can't always be seen, that make bearing children unlikely or impossible." She understood what was happening. The understanding came in stages, the way cold water rises when you step into a river. First your feet, then your knees, then the shock of it hitting your chest. She said carefully, "I was told by a physician in St. Louis that I may have difficulty." "Difficulty isn't what I'm looking for." He cut her off. Not loudly, just cut. "I have a ranch. I need a family. I need sons. That's what this arrangement was for." "Mr. Mercer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said. "I think Mrs. Alderman misrepresented your situation. That's between me and her, but I can't." He stopped, and for a moment she thought she saw something that might have been discomfort cross his face, but it was gone too fast to be sure. "I can't proceed with this arrangement." The world went very quiet. Not the kind of quiet that happens when sound stops. The kind of quiet that happens when everything inside you goes silent at once. Every hope, every plan, every carefully constructed version of the future you'd let yourself believe in. That kind of quiet. She was aware of the 2 men on the porch, aware of the woman in the apron, who had turned away slightly as if giving her the courtesy of not watching. Aware of the boy, who was watching with the frank curiosity of someone too young to know he shouldn't. She was aware of herself standing on this dirt path in a wrinkled dress, with her hair half undone after 7 days of travel, having just been refused like a shipment that didn't meet specifications. She said, "I see. I'm sorry for the inconvenience," Caleb said. He didn't sound sorry. He didn't sound anything. "I'll pay for your fare back to Don't." The word came out harder than she intended, and she saw something flicker in his pale eyes. "Don't. I don't want your fare." "Miss Hart, be reasonable. You've come a long way, and—" "I am being perfectly reasonable," she said. Her voice was steady. She was going to hang on to that, the steadiness of her own voice, because it was the only thing right now she had complete control over. "I came here in good faith, Mr. Mercer. I made arrangements. I left my life in St. Louis. I traveled for 7 days. And you are telling me, in front of witnesses, that I am not acceptable to you because of a medical opinion you solicited about a woman you hadn't yet met." His jaw tightened. Good. She wanted it to tighten. "I think you've humiliated me quite enough," she said, "and I think you know it. So you can keep your fare and your apology. I'll see myself out." She picked up her bag. It was heavier than she remembered, and she turned and walked back down the path toward the gate. She made it through to the gate and around the first bend in the road before her knees went soft. She stopped walking and stood at the edge of the road with her hand pressed flat against a pine tree, breathing carefully. Because if she stopped breathing carefully, she was going to do something she couldn't take back. Cry, maybe, or scream, or simply sit down in the dirt road and not get up for a very long time. She did none of those things. She breathed. She counted. She looked up at the sky through the pine branches, and she made herself think practically, because practical was the only kind of thinking available to a woman in her situation. She had $11.40 in her purse. She had 1 bag. She had no ticket back because she'd told herself she wouldn't need one. The nearest town, she thought it was called Harlan's Creek, the stagecoach driver had mentioned it, was 6 miles east. She had arrived on the last coach of the day. It was 2:30 in the afternoon, and the sky to the west, over the mountains, was the particular color of slate that meant weather was coming. $11.40, a 6-mile walk, a storm on the way. She straightened up, resettled her bag on her arm, and started walking east. She made it perhaps a mile before she understood she had miscalculated. Not the distance. Though the road was longer and rougher than she'd expected, and her shoes, which were sensible but were St. Louis sensible and not Montana Territory sensible, were already making her aware of exactly how different those two categories were. But the sky. She had underestimated the sky. In St. Louis, storms came in with some warning. They built slowly over the flat plain to the west, and you could watch them for an hour before the first drops fell. Here the mountains changed everything. The weather poured over the peaks and was on top of you before you'd finished deciding whether to worry about it. And by the time Evelyn looked up and registered that the slate gray had become something darker and more purposeful, the wind had picked up and the temperature had dropped a full 10 degrees in what felt like minutes. She walked faster. The first drops came when she was maybe 2 miles out from the Mercer Ranch, fat and cold, and spaced like warnings. By the time she registered them, she could already hear the deeper sound of real rain moving through the forest on either side of the road, the sound of it hitting leaves and ground like something solid. She pulled her bag in close and kept moving. She was not going back. That was not a possibility she was willing to consider. She would walk 6 miles in a thunderstorm in shoes that were already complaining before she would walk back through Caleb Mercer's gate and ask for shelter from the man who'd just rejected her in front of an audience. She walked. The rain came down properly now, and within 10 minutes she was soaked to the skin. The road had turned to mud under her feet, the kind of deep, grabbing mud that wanted to hold on to each step, and she could feel her dress getting heavier as it absorbed water, dragging at her legs. Her bag, she'd packed carefully, she'd thought she'd been so sensible about it, was getting heavier too, and her arm ached. She didn't stop. The road curved and she followed it, and then it forked, and here was the problem she'd been afraid of. She didn't know which fork to take. The driver had said east, but both forks ran roughly eastward, and in the rain and the darkening afternoon sky she'd lost whatever sense of direction she'd had. She stood at the fork, and the rain poured off the brim of her hat, and she tried to think. She was cold. She was wetter than she'd thought it was possible to be. She was standing at a fork in a road in the Montana wilderness with $11.40 and no reliable way to know which direction led to town, and the afternoon was getting dimmer by the minute, and the cold that was settling into her wet clothes was beginning to feel like more than just discomfort. She took the left fork, not because she had any particular reason to think it was right, but because standing still in the rain wasn't a choice either. She walked for another 20 minutes, and the road narrowed, which was not a good sign, and then it narrowed further and began climbing, which was also not a good sign. And then through the rain and the trees, she saw lights. Not town lights, too scattered, too warm, a single structure. She stood there for a moment, rain drumming on her hat, trying to think through what she was about to do. Walk up to a stranger's door in the middle of a Montana wilderness storm and ask for what? Shelter? Help? To be treated like a human being for the first time in several hours? She walked toward the lights. She almost didn't knock. Standing on the porch of the cabin, if you could call it a porch, it was more of a covered overhang, rough-hewn boards and a lean-to roof that kept most of the rain off. She hesitated with her hand raised, and she thought about what she must look like. Soaking wet, mud up her boots, hair plastered to her face, bags under her eyes from a week of bad sleep, carrying a bag that was now more water than luggage. She thought about the expression on Caleb Mercer's face when he'd looked at her. She knocked anyway. For a long moment, nothing. Then footsteps. Heavy ones, more than one set. And the sound of something being knocked over inside, and at least one small voice saying something that sounded like a question, and a larger voice answering with something that didn't, and then the door opened. The man standing there was large, not in the puffed-up way of men who want you to notice their size, in the way of a man who'd done physical work for most of his adult life and simply ended up that way. He was perhaps mid-30s, dark-haired, with several days of beard on a face that was weathered and serious. He was wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold, and he was holding what appeared to be a very small child, a girl, maybe 2 years old, against his hip with the automatic ease of someone who'd been doing it so long he'd stopped noticing. He looked at Evelyn. She looked at him. Behind him she could see, in the warm lamplight of the cabin's main room, what appeared to be a considerable number of children. She could make out at least 5 faces in the immediate vicinity of the door, ranging in age from the toddler on his hip to what looked like a teenager in the back, and there were more sounds from what she assumed were other rooms. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was keeping it steady. "I'm afraid I took the wrong fork in the road, and I've been walking in the rain. I was trying to get to Harlan's Creek. Could you tell me how far I've gone wrong?" He looked at her for a moment with the kind of look that was doing genuine assessment, not dismissal, taking in the mud, the soaking dress, the bag, the exhaustion she could feel in her own face. "You've gone considerably wrong," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried. "You're not on the Harlan's Creek Road. You're about 3 miles up Whitmore's Mountain." She absorbed this. "The creek road's back at the fork," he continued. "Then 4 more miles east, but it's dark in another hour and the rain's not stopping tonight." He paused. "You'd better come in." She didn't move immediately. Something in her, some instinct that had been calibrating threats and assessments all day, was making one final calculation. He seemed to read it, not offended, just patient. "My name's Gideon Walker," he said. "I've got 9 children and no wife. You're welcome to sleep in the kitchen, and I'll have one of the older ones walk you down to the Fork Road come morning." 9 children. She looked past him at the room full of faces. They were all looking at her, some curious, some uncertain, the very smallest one simply looking because something interesting was happening. There was mud on the floor near the fireplace, and a sock abandoned in the middle of the room, and a cup of something that had been knocked over at some point and hadn't been fully cleaned up. There was the smell of something that had been cooked, meat, onions, and wood smoke, and the particular atmospheric density of a space occupied by too many people. It looked nothing like the home she'd imagined waiting for her 2 miles down the other road. She stepped inside. The children were Ruth, who was 16 and had a watchful quality about her that suggested she'd been running the household in the absence of anyone else equipped to do it. Thomas, 14, the one she'd seen on the porch at the Mercer Ranch. No, that was a different boy, she reminded herself. That was a different life. This Thomas was quiet and careful with his movements, like someone perpetually worried about taking up too much space. Clara, 12, with a gap in her front teeth and an immediate interest in Evelyn that she didn't bother to conceal. The twins James and Joseph, 10 years old and physically identical, but temperamentally as different as 2 people could be. James all noise and motion, and Joseph watching everything from the corners with dark, serious eyes. Hannah, 8, who was running a slight fever and had been put on the bench near the fire with a blanket, and who regarded Evelyn from this position with drowsy skepticism. William, 6, who wanted to know immediately, and without preamble, if Evelyn had come from far away, and if she'd seen any bears. Nora, 4, who didn't want to know anything, but was attached to Evelyn's wet skirt within 30 seconds of her entry in the way that very small children attach to things with complete indifference to the feelings of the attached to party, and the toddler from the doorway, whose name was May, and who was still on Gideon's hip, and who had gone to sleep somewhere between the door and the fireplace with the total commitment to unconsciousness that only very small children can manage. Evelyn learned all of this in the first 20 minutes, partly from the children themselves, and partly from the chaos of a household with 9 occupants, trying to resume whatever the evening had been before the soaking wet stranger knocked on the door. Gideon Walker had said little after "you'd better come in." He'd pointed her to a chair near the fire, told Ruth to get a dry blanket, taken May to a back room to put her down, and then returned to the kitchen where something was burning, mildly, not catastrophically, and silently saved it. Ruth brought the blanket. She was polite about it, but her eyes were doing the same assessment her father's had done, and Evelyn had the impression that Ruth Walker had learned to be careful about people the way you learn to be careful about anything that had the power to affect you. "Thank you," Evelyn said. "You're welcome." A pause. "Where were you trying to get to?" "Harlan's Creek. There was an arrangement that—" She stopped. She wrapped the blanket more firmly around her shoulders and tried again. "I arrived today expecting to stay somewhere else. It didn't work out. I was trying to get to town." Ruth's expression didn't change much, but something in it softened fractionally. "Did something happen at the Mercer place?" Evelyn looked at her. I saw you come up from that direction, Ruth said, matter of fact. And we hear things in town sometimes about how Mr. Mercer handles arrangements. Evelyn absorbed this. Is that so? He's let 2 women go like that. Since his wife. Since we've known him. Ruth seemed to be deciding how much to say. People talk. I imagine they do. Are you all right? The question was asked with the careful directness of someone who didn't ask questions lightly and wanted a real answer, not a social one. Evelyn found herself looking at this 16-year-old girl, this girl who had clearly been keeping a household together through will and exhaustion and whatever her father could manage, and found she didn't have the energy to perform being all right. No, she said, not particularly, but I'll manage. Ruth nodded as if this was a satisfactory answer. There's food left if you want it. I don't want to impose. We made too much. Ruth said it plainly. We always make too much. Hannah's sick, and May won't eat anything that isn't cut into very small pieces. Sit down and I'll get you a bowl. Evelyn sat down. Gideon Walker did not, over the course of that evening, ask her what had happened at the Mercer Ranch. He did not ask why she'd come, or how long she planned to stay, or anything at all about her circumstances. He fed his children, settled the argument between James and Joseph about whose turn it was to get water from the well. Joseph's, it turned out, and Joseph accepted this verdict with the stoic resignation of a man twice his age, checked on Hannah's fever, and moved through his home with the practiced efficiency of someone running a very tight operation on not enough resources. He was not warm. He was not cold either. He was simply present in a way that was entirely focused on the practical reality of his household, and not particularly interested in the emotional content of anything happening beyond the walls of it. But he didn't ask her to leave. And when Evelyn, after eating, the food was simple and not particularly seasoned, but she was hungry enough that it didn't matter, asked if there was something she could do, something useful, some way she could help in exchange for the shelter, he had looked at her with those serious dark eyes and said, Hannah needs someone to sit with her tonight. She gets frightened when she's sick, and none of the others sleep well when she's up. So Evelyn sat with Hannah. She sat by the fire in that overcrowded, cluttered, entirely impractical mountain cabin, with a blanket around her shoulders and a small sick girl sleeping fitfully on the bench beside her. And she listened to the rain come down outside and the mountain wind talk to itself in the trees. And she thought about Caleb Mercer's pale eyes and the word arrangement and the 7 days on the coach and the $11.40 still in her purse. She thought about what she was. She was 31 years old, and she was not pretty, and she could not, as far as any physician had been able to determine with confidence, have children of her own. She had come a week's journey for a future that had collapsed in under 10 minutes. She was sitting in a stranger's kitchen because she'd taken the wrong fork in a rainstorm. She was also, she noticed, and this surprised her coming in through the back door of her exhaustion, not entirely unhappy to be exactly here, in this chair, with this fire, with this rain outside and this small girl who had reached out in her sleep and found Evelyn's hand and held on to it. Hannah's hand was very small and very warm from the fever. She was holding it the way small children hold things, completely, without calculation. Evelyn didn't pull away. She sat there until the fire burned low, and then she built it up again, and she sat there some more, and she thought, this is not what I came here for, and she thought, and yet here I am. And she thought nothing after that for a while because she was more tired than she'd ever been in her life, and the rain was coming down, and the fire was warm, and Hannah's small feverish hand was holding on to hers like Evelyn Hart was something worth holding on to. She slept in the chair. In the morning, the rain had stopped. The light that came through the kitchen window was thin and pale, the washed-out silver of a mountain morning after a storm, and it fell across the floor in long, clean angles and caught the dust motes and made them briefly luminous. Hannah's fever had broken. Evelyn could tell by the cool feel of her forehead when she checked it. The child had rolled to face the back of the bench in the night and was sleeping with the deep, replenishing sleep that comes after illness breaks. Evelyn built up the fire. She didn't think about it very hard. She simply saw that the fire had gone low in the night, and she built it up because there were 9 children in this house, and the morning was cold and it needed doing. She found the kettle and she found the water barrel, and she started water heating because there would be a household waking up shortly, and a sick child who would want something warm, and 8 other children who would want breakfast. She was rummaging in the pantry, taking stock of what was there. More flour than she'd expected, less salt pork than was practical for this many mouths. A good number of dried beans, some preserves that looked like they'd been made at least 2 years ago, when she heard boots on the stairs. Gideon Walker appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was dressed, or mostly dressed, his flannel shirt only partially tucked, and he stopped when he saw her at the pantry with his household inventory apparently underway, and his expression was one she couldn't immediately read. Not angry. Something more like a man who expected one thing and found something different. "Hannah's fever broke," she said before he could say anything. "She's sleeping well. I didn't want to wake her." He looked at the fire, which was going properly now, and at the kettle, and at Evelyn standing in his pantry. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." She turned back to the shelf. "You're running low on salt pork. And the preserves in the back, the ones in the brown jars, I think they've turned. You should check them before anyone eats them." There was a pause. "Are you always like this?" he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "Like what?" He didn't answer immediately. He came into the kitchen and looked at the fire and then at Hannah, still sleeping on the bench. Something passed over his face that was too private to name. "I'll walk you down to the Fork Road after breakfast," he said. "If you still want to go to town." She turned back to the pantry. She still wanted to go to town. That was the practical thing. That was the sensible thing. She had $11.40, and she needed to find work and lodgings and some kind of plan that didn't involve sitting in a mountain cabin waiting for a life to appear. She stood there with her hand on the shelf. "Mr. Walker," she said, without turning around, "how long has your wife been gone?" "A beat." 3 years, he said. "And you've been managing the household yourself since then. Ruth helps. Ruth is 16 and exhausted, and she shouldn't have to be the woman of the house." She said it simply, not unkindly, but directly. "I can see it in how she carries herself. That's a great deal of weight for a girl her age." Another beat, longer this time. "What are you asking?" he said. His voice was careful. "I'm asking if you need help." She turned around now and looked at him. He was watching her with that same serious, assessing expression he'd had at the door last night. "Not charity, not, I don't want anything from you that isn't fair exchange, but you have 9 children and a household and a ranch to run and one daughter who's running herself into the ground trying to hold it together, and I'm—" She stopped, breathed. "I need somewhere to be. I need work. I can cook and manage a household and teach the younger children their letters and numbers if they haven't had proper schooling. I won't be a burden. If it doesn't work, you can tell me and I'll go." He looked at her for a long time. She made herself hold still. "You'd stay," he said. "In the cabin, with 9 children. I stayed last night. That was an emergency." "This is also an emergency," she said. "You just haven't been calling it one long enough to see it." He said nothing. Behind him, from somewhere upstairs, came the sound of small feet hitting floorboards, the household beginning to wake. "1 month," he said, finally. "You stay a month. If it's not working, for either of us, you go to town and I'll give you fair home, wherever home is." "I don't have a home to go back to," she said, "but 1 month is fair." He nodded. He went to the stairs. "Mr. Walker," she said. He stopped. "The salt pork. Can you get more when you go to town next?" He looked at her. Something that might have been the very earliest stage of something. Not a smile exactly, something more tentative than that, crossed his face and was gone before she could be sure of it. "I go Thursday," he said. "I'll make a list," she said, and turned back to the pantry. In the main room, Hannah stirred on the bench and made a small sound. From upstairs came more feet, more voices, the whole chaotic machinery of a large family coming awake. Outside the kitchen window, the mountain morning was brightening, the storm-washed sky going from silver to pale gold, and the trees along the ridge were dark and clean against it. Evelyn found the oats. She found the pot. She started breakfast. She didn't think too hard about the future. She just thought about the oats and the fire and the fact that there were 9 children about to come down those stairs, and one of them had been sick through the night and all of them needed to eat. She could do that much. She could do that, and then she could do the next thing. And then the thing after that. She had always been good at doing the next thing. But she didn't know, that morning in the kitchen, with the pale gold light coming through the window and the sound of 9 children coming awake upstairs, that the next thing would take her somewhere she hadn't imagined. She didn't know about Caleb Mercer's secret, the one that would change everything she thought she understood about why she'd been turned away. She didn't know about Victor Langford, who was already tracking her, methodically, patiently, from the life she thought she'd left behind. She knew the oats were in the pot. She knew the fire was going. She knew, for the first time in a very long time, that her hands were busy, and her mind was quiet, and she was in some impossible and provisional way exactly where she was supposed to be. That was enough. For now, it was enough. The first week was the hardest. Not because the work was beyond her, so Evelyn had never been afraid of work, had in fact always found a particular kind of peace in it, in the simple transaction of effort and result. The kitchen came clean because she cleaned it. The floors came clean because she swept them. These were understandable equations, and she had always preferred understandable equations to the social ones, which never seemed to balance properly, no matter how carefully she did the arithmetic. The hard part was the children, not because they were difficult exactly, though some of them were. James, the louder of the 2 10-year-old twins, treated the first 3 days as an extended negotiation over whether Evelyn had any authority over him at all, testing every boundary she drew with the cheerful determination of someone who genuinely wanted to know where the walls were. Joseph watched all of this from the corners with his serious dark eyes and said nothing, which was in some ways more unsettling than James's open challenges, because Evelyn couldn't read him yet. William, who was 6 and deeply interested in bears, transferred his bear-related questions to Evelyn with an efficiency that suggested she had simply replaced a previous source of information on the topic. And she had to explain to him twice in the first 2 days that she had not, in fact, seen any bears on her way up the mountain, and that she was not sure whether bears in Montana were larger than bears elsewhere, and that she did not know if bears could smell fear, though she personally had her suspicions. Nora was still attached to her skirt. This had continued past the point where Evelyn had expected it to stop. Clara, 12 years old, the gap-toothed one, had decided within approximately 48 hours that Evelyn was the most interesting thing that had happened on Whitmore's Mountain in years, and she followed her through the house, asking questions with the systematic persistence of someone conducting research. Where had Evelyn come from? What was St. Louis like? Had she ever been to a proper city with streetcars? Did she know how to do embroidery? Why had she come to Montana? Did she know Mr. Mercer? And at this last one, Claire had watched Evelyn's face with very attentive 12-year-old eyes, and Evelyn had said, calmly, that she had met Mr. Mercer briefly, and Clara had said, "Oh," in a tone that contained about 6 different flavors of information, and had then moved on to asking about streetcars. Hannah recovered fully from her fever by the second day. She was 8 years old and had the careful, watchful quality of a child who had been sick enough times to understand that the world was not entirely reliable. She watched Evelyn for the first 3 days without speaking to her directly, and then on the 4th day she appeared in the kitchen while Evelyn was making bread and said, without preamble, "My mother used to make bread on Thursdays." Evelyn kept working the dough. What did it smell like? Hannah considered this. Like flour, and something sweet. She put something in it. I can't remember what. Some people use honey. Some use a little molasses. Molasses, Hannah said with sudden certainty. That was it. Evelyn reached for the jar on the shelf. Do you want to try? Hannah came and stood beside her at the table, and they made the bread together, and it was not the same as her mother's. Evelyn was honest about that. She didn't pretend otherwise. But it was good, and when the younger children ate it at dinner that night and William said it was the best bread he'd ever had, Hannah looked up at Evelyn across the table with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. Ruth watched all of this. Evelyn was aware of being watched. Ruth Walker had been running this household on will and habit, and the quiet desperation of a girl who understood that if she stopped, things would fall apart, and she had been doing it long enough that she'd forgotten she was 16 and not 45. She got up before anyone else, and she went to bed after anyone else, and she did not complain about any of it, not loudly. Anyway, but Evelyn could see the exhaustion in the set of her shoulders, and the way she sometimes paused in the middle of a task, as if she'd momentarily forgotten what the task was, or why she'd started it. On the 5th day, Evelyn told Ruth to sleep late. Ruth looked at her like she'd suggested something mildly illegal. I'll handle breakfast, Evelyn said. You sleep until 7, 8 if you want. I can't just... Ruth, Evelyn kept her voice even. I'm here. That's what I'm here for. Sleep. Ruth slept until nearly 9, and when she came downstairs there was color in her face that hadn't been there before. And she ate her breakfast without jumping up twice to get things for other people. And she sat for 20 minutes after the meal with her hands empty and her shoulders something approaching relaxed, and Evelyn noticed all of this without saying anything about it. Gideon Walker existed at the edges of all of this. He was up before dawn and out working before Evelyn could reliably say she'd heard him go. He came in for meals, ate with the focused economy of a man who needed fuel and didn't have time to think of food as anything else. And he answered the children's questions at the table with the kind of brief, complete answers that didn't invite much follow-up. After dinner, he sat near the fire with whatever mending or accounts needed doing, and once or twice Evelyn had come through the main room after getting May to sleep, and found him there with a piece of harness leather in his hands that he wasn't working on, just holding, looking at the fire. He didn't talk to her much. She didn't push it. She understood, or she thought she understood, the particular shape of his silence. A man who had lost a wife and carried on alone for 3 years and built a wall around the part of himself that had once been open was not going to dismantle that wall because a stranger had appeared in his kitchen and started making bread. That was not how walls worked. She knew, because she had some of her own. What she noticed was that he was consistent. That was the word for it. He was the same every day. The same level, present, practical attention to the reality in front of him. He did not lose his temper with the children, even when James knocked over a full water bucket in the kitchen for the second time in 3 days, and even when Joseph's quiet watchfulness occasionally shaded into a sullenness that had a bit of an edge to it. He was not effusive with them, but he was there. And in Evelyn's experience, there covered a great deal of ground that people assumed required something more spectacular. The children clearly knew it. Even James, for all his boundary testing with Evelyn, had a different quality when his father was in the room. Not fearful, nothing like that, but grounded, the way a compass needle finds north. On the 8th day, Evelyn heard him arguing with Ruth. Not loudly. Gideon Walker didn't seem to do anything loudly, but she was in the kitchen, and they were in the main room, and the walls were thin, and she caught the substance of it without trying. Ruth wanted to go into Harlan's Creek the following Saturday. There was apparently a gathering of some kind, a community social, and she wanted to go. Gideon thought she couldn't be spared from the household. "Papa," Ruth said, and her voice had a particular quality to it, the voice of a girl who had been reasonable about so many things for so long that she was reaching the end of her supply of reason. "I haven't been to town in 6 weeks. I haven't seen anyone my age in 6 weeks. I'm not asking for the whole day. I'm asking for the afternoon. The little ones need... Miss Hart is here." A pause. "She can manage them for an afternoon. She manages them every day." A longer pause. "She's only been here 8 days, Gideon said. And in 8 days she's taught William to write his name and gotten Hannah to eat vegetables without a fight, and figured out that James behaves better if you give him a job to do instead of telling him to sit still." Ruth's voice was flat with the effort of patience. "She's not going anywhere, Papa. Let me go to town." Another pause. Then, "Be back before dark." Evelyn turned back to the pot she was stirring and kept her face neutral. The Saturday social came, and Ruth went to town, and Evelyn managed the children for the afternoon. And it was... fine was the word that kept presenting itself, and she kept examining it from different angles trying to find the problem with it because it seemed too simple. William wanted to show her the spot by the creek where he'd seen what he was 70% certain had been bear tracks. Joseph needed help with a reading passage he was stuck on. He was smarter than his silence advertised. She'd figured that out by now, and he processed language differently than the others. Needed more time with words on the page, but understood what he'd read with a completeness that surprised her. James needed, as Ruth had apparently correctly diagnosed, something to do, and she set him to reorganizing the woodpile, which occupied him entirely for 90 minutes, and earned her a look of grudging acknowledgement that she suspected was his version of respect. May fell asleep in her arms sometime around 3 o'clock, which happened with increasing regularity, and which Evelyn had decided she was simply going to accept without examining too hard. Gideon came in from the north pasture around 4, moving with the slight stiffness that meant he'd been doing fence work. She'd noticed this pattern, the way his right shoulder sat after physical labor, and he stopped when he saw her on the bench near the window, May asleep against her chest, mending something of Clara's in her free hand. He stood there for a moment. "Ruth not back yet?" he said, which was not what his face was asking. "She said before dark," Evelyn said. "It's not dark yet." He nodded. He went to wash up. She looked back at her mending. May breathed slowly against her. Outside the window, the afternoon light had gone amber, and through it she could see James sitting on top of the reorganized woodpile with the satisfied posture of someone who had accomplished something significant. She thought about St. Louis. She thought about the rooms she'd lived in above other people's lives, and the drawing rooms where she'd stood at the edges of things, and the letter with its plain-spoken promise that had turned out to be neither plain nor promising. She thought about Hannah's hand, small and feverish, holding on to hers in the night. She did not let herself make too much of any of it. That was dangerous. She was here for a month. Those were the terms. And at the end of the month, either it was working or it wasn't, and she was not going to build anything elaborate on a foundation that was still provisional. But she noticed that she had not thought about leaving in the last 4 days. She noticed that without assigning it too much weight. By the end of the second week, she had found a rhythm. Mornings belonged to the kitchen. Breakfast, the planning of the day's meals, the inventory of what needed replenishing, the particular logistical exercise of feeding 9 children on a budget that required considerable creativity. Mid-morning, she'd carved out for the younger children's schooling, which had become something more formal than she'd intended when it turned out that Hannah, William, and Nora had had only sporadic instruction and there were significant gaps. She sat them at the kitchen table with chalk and slate boards Gideon had sourced somewhere, and she taught with the same practical directness she applied to everything. This is how you make the letter A. This is why 2 + 2 = 4 and not 3. This is how you sound out a word you don't know. James attended these sessions voluntarily starting on the 3rd day, which she didn't make a fuss about. She simply made room for him and gave him harder problems to work, and he applied himself to them with a competitive intensity that he did not appear to recognize as academic interest. The afternoons were the ranch. She was not a farm woman by training. She'd grown up in a city. She had no illusions about that. But she was not incompetent, and she understood that she was useless to Gideon Walker's household if she only managed the indoors. So she learned. She learned which animals needed what. She learned the vocabulary of the fences and the pastures and the practical geography of the ranch. She learned to read the weather coming over the mountains because in this place it was a relevant skill. Ruth showed her some of it, plainly and without condescension, and Thomas she'd underestimated, the careful, quiet one, turned out to have a gift for explaining things and showed her where the hay was stored and how to check the cattle for injury, and several other things she'd have had to ask Gideon and hadn't wanted to. Thomas, she thought, would have made a good teacher if he'd been born somewhere with schools and the means to reach them. She told him so one afternoon, out of nowhere, because she was thinking it and she'd started to trust that direct was usually better than careful with this family. He looked at her with the quiet surprise of someone who'd never had that particular thought applied to himself. "I don't know," he said after a moment. "You explained the hay storage in a way that took me 3 minutes to understand and 4 hours to understand from trying to figure it out myself," she said. "That's a gift." He was quiet for a moment, then, "My mother said I was good at explaining things." She was right. He nodded once and went back to what he'd been doing. But he was slightly different after that, a degree less careful, a degree more present. The second Saturday, Gideon came in from the south field at midday instead of evening, which was unusual, and he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that he didn't drink and looked at the surface of it as if it owed him something. Evelyn let it sit for a while. She finished what she was doing, which was the accounts. He'd given her the household ledger on the 10th day without ceremony, simply set it on the table beside her with the comment that Ruth had been doing it. But Ruth wasn't good with numbers, which was true. She'd looked at Ruth's entries and there were errors. And when the silence had gone on long enough, she said, without looking up, "What happened?" He didn't answer right away. She'd learned this about him. He took time with words, not because he was slow, but because he was careful. And there was a difference. "Lost a calf," he said. Not the weather, not an animal, just weak. Came out wrong and didn't make it. I'm sorry. He turned the cup in his hands. That's the third this season. Something's wrong with the breeding or the feed or I'm... He stopped. I don't know. Is that usual? 3 in a season? No. He looked up at her. No, it's not usual. She set down her pen. Has the feed changed? Did you switch suppliers? He looked at her with a slight furrowing of his brow that was not unfriendly, more like the look of someone recalculating something. Why? I was reading the feed records in the back of this ledger, she said. You switched to a different supplier in March. The cost entry changed and there's a different notation. She turned the book toward him. I don't know if it means anything. I don't know enough about cattle feed to say, but it's there. He looked at the ledger. He looked at it for a long time, and then something shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly, but the particular release of a man who has been carrying a problem alone for long enough that simply having it acknowledged by another person changes the weight of it. Hargroves, he said. In town. He offered a better price. I thought... He stopped. I'll write to Doc Prentice in Billings. He knows livestock. Good. He looked at her across the table. Miss Hart, he said. Evelyn, she said, not for the first time. She'd told him 3 times and he kept reverting. She'd decided this was not resistance so much as habit. He'd been alone long enough that new names didn't stick easily. Evelyn. He said it like he was deciding something. I want to say what you've done for the children, for Ruth especially. He stopped, started again. I know Ruth was carrying too much. I knew it. There wasn't another stop. He was a man who found feelings harder to assemble into words than fence posts. I'm grateful. You don't have to. I know I don't. A brief flash of something in his eyes that might have been stubbornness. I'm saying it anyway. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the same serious, direct attention he turned on everything, the same quality of being fully present in the moment without a great deal of ornament around it. And she thought, this is what an honest person looks like. Not a perfect person, not a smooth person, an honest one. You're welcome, she said. He nodded, picked up his coffee, still undrunk, probably cold, and took it outside. The month turned on a Tuesday, quietly, without announcement. Evelyn realized it in the morning when she was getting dressed and thought, 30 days. The terms had been 30 days, and now 30 days had passed, and neither of them had said anything about it. She thought about raising it. She composed the conversation in her head 2 or 3 times. Mr. Walker, it's been a month. I wanted to check in about the arrangement. I understand if circumstances have changed. She didn't raise it. Not because she was afraid of the answer, exactly, but because she looked at the household around her, at Hannah sitting at the kitchen table sounding out words from the reader, at William, who was now writing his full name and had moved on to numbers and had a competitive need to beat James at arithmetic, at Clara, who had started helping her cook in the afternoons, at Ruth, who slept until 7 every day now and had come back from the second Saturday social with slightly more color in her face and the tentative, cautious quality of someone who was beginning to remember that she was young. And she thought, this is working. Whatever else it is, this is working. She made breakfast. The children came downstairs in their usual overlapping chaos. May demanded to be carried, which Evelyn did, because May had figured out several weeks ago that Evelyn would and had stopped asking anyone else. Joseph sat beside Hannah at the table and helped her with a word she was stuck on, which he had started doing naturally, without being asked, because apparently he had decided at some point that Hannah's reading was something he had a stake in. Gideon came in from the barn and washed his hands and sat at the head of the table and looked at the room. At all of it, the noise and the food and the overlapping conversations, at Ruth actually laughing at something James had said, at Hannah reading under her breath. And then he looked at Evelyn, and she was already looking back at him, and neither of them said anything, and neither of them needed to. It was Clara who named it first, in the accidental way that 12-year-olds name things, saying out loud what the adults have been carefully not saying. She said it at dinner 3 days later. She'd been talking about something at school, She rode down the mountain with Thomas twice a week for lessons in town. And she said, in the middle of a story about her teacher, I told Mrs. Calloway that we had someone at home now, someone who, I said we had a family again. The table went quiet. Not the awkward quiet of something breaking, but the held breath quiet of something landing. James looked at the ceiling. Joseph looked at his plate. Thomas was very still. Ruth had a particular careful expression that suggested she was deciding how she felt about this. Hannah looked at Evelyn across the table with her watchful 8-year-old eyes. Gideon was looking at his hands. Clara seemed to suddenly understand that she had said something larger than she'd intended, and she went slightly pink. I meant that everything works better. The house and I just meant that. I know what you meant, sweetheart, Evelyn said, and kept her voice steady and easy, not making too much of it, not making too little. Eat your dinner. The conversation moved on. The noise came back. May, who had followed none of this, put a piece of bread in Evelyn's hand with the decisive generosity of a 2-year-old making an important gift, and Evelyn ate the bread, and the table went on being exactly what it was. Under it, in the part of herself she kept private, she felt something that was warm and precarious and real. She felt it, and she was careful with it, the way you're careful with something that matters and that you haven't earned outright and aren't sure you're allowed to keep. She looked down the table at all of it, the 9 children, and the food, and the warm light, and the man at the head of the table who was looking at his plate, and she thought, be careful. And then she thought, but you already are too far in to be only careful. Dumb. It was Gideon who said something in the end. He said it on a Sunday evening when the children were asleep and the house was quiet. In the particular way it got quiet after a long, full day, the settled quiet of a lot of people at rest under one roof. He was at the table with the feed accounts. He'd written to Doc Prentice, and Prentice had confirmed the feed supply was likely the problem, and he was in the process of tracking down a better source. And Evelyn was mending one of Joseph's shirts, the 3rd time it had needed mending at the same spot, which told her something about how Joseph used his elbows. Gideon said, without looking up, Clara was right. Evelyn kept her needle moving. She oversimplified it, he said, the way children do. But she was right. I know. He looked up. He had the expression he got when he was working through something he found difficult, not because he was incapable, but because he was honest. And honesty sometimes made things harder, not easier. I wasn't looking for this, he said. I wasn't looking for anything. When I opened the door that night, you were looking for a reason to send me back down the mountain. He paused. Yes, he said. Honestly, yes. And then Hannah needed someone. And then Hannah needed someone, he said. And then all of them did. And then you were... He stopped. You were just there. Every morning you were just there and you made it easier, and I didn't know how much easier it could be until you showed me, and now I don't... He stopped again. He was not a man who apologized for taking his time with words, and she'd learned to wait. I don't know what this is, he said finally. I'm not trying to say I do. I'm just saying that I would like for you to stay. Not just as help with the house. He looked at her steadily. As part of it. Whatever that takes. Evelyn set down the shirt. She looked at this man across the table. This serious, weathered, imperfect man who ran an overcrowded mountain ranch on not enough resources with 9 children who needed more than one person could give, who had opened his door in a rainstorm to a stranger and offered her his kitchen floor and hadn't once asked her what she'd done to deserve Caleb Mercer's rejection, who held May against his hip like he'd been born with an arm, the right shape for it, and took the time he needed with words and drove fence posts with the kind of deliberate effort that came from doing hard things without expecting them to be easy. I'd like that too, she said. He nodded. He looked back at the accounts. She looked back at the shirt. Outside, the mountain was dark, and the first cold edge of autumn was in the air, coming down from the peaks the way it always did, early and without apology. Inside, the fire settled and the house breathed around them, and somewhere upstairs one of the children shifted in sleep and was still. Neither of them said anything more about it that night. They didn't need to. Some things you say once and then you just live them forward, and that's the shape they take. And that's enough. But later, when Evelyn lay in the kitchen on her pallet listening to the dark and the mountain wind outside, she thought about the fork in the road, the fork in the rain where she'd had to choose a direction without knowing which one was right. She'd taken the wrong fork. She'd been 3 miles up the wrong mountain in a thunderstorm with $11.40 and a bag full of wet clothes, and she'd taken the wrong fork. And she was here. She thought about the way things went wrong and then went somewhere unexpected, and how sometimes the unexpected place turned out to be the place that had been waiting for you, except you'd had to come the wrong way to find it. She thought about this, and she wasn't sure what to make of it, whether it was lucky or just the way things went, whether there was something in it, or whether she was tired enough that she was putting meaning into what was simply the motion of events. She fell asleep before she could decide. In the morning, she got up and made the fire and started the oats, and Nora came downstairs first, as she always did, and attached herself to Evelyn's skirt, and the day began. She didn't know yet what was coming. She didn't know that in 10 days, a man from town would arrive with news that would change the story she'd been telling herself about what had happened at the Mercer Ranch. She didn't know that the past she'd left behind in St. Louis had not stayed there. She didn't know that what was coming would test everything she'd built in this mountain house, not just her place in it, but the whole fragile, real, imperfect life she'd started to believe she was allowed to have. She didn't know any of that. She just knew the fire was going and the oats needed stirring, and in a few minutes there would be 9 children on the stairs. She stirred the oat. The news came in on a Tuesday, the way bad news often did, attached to something ordinary, writing in underneath something else so you didn't see it until it had already arrived. Ruth had gone to town for flour and salt and a spool of thread, a routine errand she'd started handling alone now that the household had someone steady in it. She came back in the early afternoon with the supplies and a quietness about her that Evelyn recognized before she'd even set the basket down. Ruth was not a quiet girl by nature. She was measured, careful, but there was an underlying current of energy to her that usually moved through a room when she entered it. When that was absent, something was wrong. Evelyn waited. She'd learned with Ruth that waiting was better than asking. She was helping Clara peel potatoes. Clara had decided that cooking was interesting in the same way she'd decided Evelyn was interesting, with the same systematic dedication. And she kept her eyes on the work and let Ruth move through the kitchen and put away the flour and the salt and set the thread on the shelf near the mending basket. She listened to the slight extra deliberateness in Ruth's movements, the sound of a person organizing herself. Then Ruth said, "People are talking in town." "About what?" "About you." A pause. "About you and Mr. Mercer." Clara's peeling slowed. Evelyn kept her pace steady. "What are they saying?" Ruth came and sat down at the table. She folded her hands in front of her, and the gesture was so adult, so characteristic of a girl who'd had to be grown for too long, that Evelyn felt a familiar ache for her. "Mrs. Colton at the dry goods told me," Ruth said. "She didn't mean it unkindly. I think she was trying to warn me. She said there's a story going around that a woman came to Mr. Mercer under false pretenses, that she misrepresented her situation, that there was something wrong with her, and she hid it." The potato in Evelyn's hand felt very solid. She focused on that. "She didn't use your name," Ruth continued, "but she said the woman from St. Louis who came on the September coach, and there's only one of those." "No," Clara said sharply, forgetting she was supposed to be only peeling potatoes. "That's not—" "Clara," Evelyn said. Clara stopped. She was looking at Evelyn with her gap-toothed jaw set in an expression of 12-year-old fury that was, under other circumstances, somewhat endearing. Evelyn set down the potato. She looked at her hands for a moment. She thought about Caleb Mercer's pale eyes and his flat, economical voice saying, "I can't proceed with this arrangement." She thought about the 2 men on the porch who had been witnesses to exactly what had happened, and what those 2 men might have said afterward, and to whom. "He started it," she said, not really to either of them, more to herself, assembling the pieces. "He needed a story that put the problem on my side." "Why?" Clara asked. "Because the alternative," Evelyn said, "is that he turned away a woman who'd traveled a week to get here, in front of witnesses, and the town has to decide how it feels about that. This way he controls what they decide." Ruth was watching her with those careful adult eyes. "What will you do?" Evelyn picked up the potato again. "Peel potatoes," she said, "and think." She thought about it for 3 days before she told Gideon. She hadn't decided not to tell him. She'd decided she needed to understand it first herself before she handed it to someone else to understand. This was how she'd always worked. She processed inward before she moved outward, and in the meantime she kept things running the way they needed to run, and she watched the situation the way you watched a developing storm, not with panic, but with the attention it deserved. What she understood by the end of those 3 days was that Caleb Mercer had begun dismantling her reputation, such as it was, such as she'd had 6 weeks to build in a town where she'd barely been seen, with the efficiency of a man who'd done this before. Ruth had said he'd let 2 women go like that. She'd said it offhandedly, as a piece of local knowledge, and at the time Evelyn had filed it and moved on. Now she took it back out and looked at it properly. 2 women before her. 2 women sent away from Caleb Mercer's ranch, and presumably 2 stories floating around Harlan's Creek afterward. 2 reputations quietly and efficiently damaged to protect the one that mattered to him. She thought about what Ruth had said. Something wrong with her, and she hid it. She thought about what it meant that he'd framed it that way. Not I changed my mind or we weren't suited. Those were things you could say about a man who'd made a decision. He'd made it about her, about something wrong with her, something she'd hidden. On the 3rd night, she came into the main room after the children were in bed, and Gideon was at his usual place by the fire. She sat down across from him, and she said, without preamble, because she'd learned that preambles made him tighten up, "There's gossip in town about me, about why Mercer turned me away." He looked up from the harness he was working. "I heard." She stared at him. "You heard." "Ed Pierce mentioned it when I was in town Thursday." He set down the harness. "I didn't say anything because I was waiting to see if you were going to tell me." She absorbed this. "And if I hadn't? Then I'd have said something myself," he said. "Eventually." "What did Ed Pierce say?" "He said Mercer was telling people you'd deceived him about your health, that you'd come under false pretenses." Gideon's voice was level and without particular inflection, which she'd learned did not mean he was without feeling. It meant the feeling was somewhere he was keeping it. "I told Ed that I'd had you in my household for going on 6 weeks, and I hadn't found you to be a deceitful person." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you." "It's not a favor," he said. "It's what I observed." She looked at the fire. "He's building a version of events where I'm the problem. It's cleaner for him that way." "I know what he's doing." 2 women before me," she said. Ruth mentioned it. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Mercer's got a particular kind of pride," he said, and she could hear the deliberateness of the words, the way he was choosing them carefully. "He doesn't handle being seen to be wrong, whatever his reason for turning them away, and people have wondered about the reason, the first time and the second time. He needed it to not be about him. And now the 3rd time people might start to see a pattern," Evelyn said. "Unless the 3rd woman is thoroughly discredited," Gideon said. "Yes." She sat with that. The fire shifted. Outside, the mountain wind was doing its usual evening conversation with the pines. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "I've been thinking about what he said. At the ranch. He was very specific." She kept her voice even, because what she was about to say was something she'd turned over carefully, and she wanted to say it right. He cited a physician. He said he'd spoken with someone who knew about conditions that affect a woman's ability to have children. She paused. He knew the exact nature of what I'd been told in St. Louis, not just that there might be difficulty, the specifics. Gideon was very still. "Mrs. Alderman's arrangement service," Evelyn said. She knew. I told her in confidence, in correspondence, because it was a relevant factor in any arrangement. I told her so she could be honest with men she was matching me with. She looked at her hands. But I told her it was to be used with my consent, that I would tell a prospective match myself, in my own time. "You think she told him?" "I think she told him more than she should have, and I think what he knew wasn't just what she told him." She stopped. She'd been here before in her own head, and she kept coming back to the same place. What he described, the way he described it, it was the exact phrasing from a medical letter I received 18 months ago. A specific letter. I never shared that language with Mrs. Alderman. I shared the situation, not those words. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was full. "Someone gave him the letter," Gideon said, "or a copy, or told him exactly what it said." She looked at him. "I don't know how. I don't know who had access to it. I'm not certain I'm right. But it was the exact phrasing, Gideon. I've read that letter enough times to know every word in it, and he used those words." He was looking at her with that steady, direct gaze. He picked up the harness again, not to work it, just to have something in his hands. She'd noticed he did this when he was thinking hard. Langford, he said. The name hit her like cold water. She had not said that name to him. She had not said it to anyone in this household, in this territory, since arriving. She had in fact been operating on the unexamined assumption that distance was sufficient protection, that a week's travel in a mountain range and a new life constituted a barrier that didn't need to be named. How do you know that name? She said. You mentioned him, Gideon said, weeks ago. You were half asleep in the chair by the fire, the third night you were here. Hannah had been up sick again, and you'd been up with her, and you weren't fully awake. You said Langford won't find me here. He looked at her steadily. I didn't ask about it then because it wasn't the time, but I remembered it. She looked at the fire. Victor Langford. She'd hoped, she'd told herself, that coming this far, leaving without a forwarding address, starting completely over, was enough. She'd believed it the way you believe things you need to believe in order to function. She should have known better. He's a businessman in St. Louis, she said, a significant one. He owns property and a number of commercial interests. He also... She stopped, chose her words. He had an interest in me that was not mutual. For about 2 years, he made that interest known in various ways, and when I made clear that it would never be welcome, he made things difficult. What kind of difficult? The kind that money makes possible, she said. He spoke to my employer. I lost my position. He spoke to my landlord. I lost my rooms. He made it known in several social circles that there were questions about my character. She said this flatly, looking at the fire, not letting herself feel the old anger too much because it didn't help. It was very efficiently done. He never did anything that could be clearly called wrong, just consequences, one after another. That's why you left, Gideon said. Mrs. Alderman's service was supposed to be confidential, a fresh start somewhere far enough away that his reach didn't extend. She almost laughed, but it wasn't really funny. Except apparently it does. You think he got to Mercer? I think he found out where I'd gone, and I think he arranged for Mercer to reject me in the most public, damaging way possible. She said it out loud for the first time and heard how it sounded, not paranoid, she didn't think, but like the kind of thing that made sense when you knew what Victor Langford was capable of. The letter, the phrasing, Mercer is not a sophisticated man. He wouldn't have gone looking for a physician's report on a woman he'd never met without someone directing him to it. That's not how he thinks. Gideon set down the harness. He laced his hands together and looked at them, and Evelyn recognized the posture. It was his thinking posture, the one he took when he was assembling something. What does Langford want? He said. Control, she said. That's what he's always wanted. He doesn't want me specifically. He's not in love with me. He never was. He wants me to have no options. He wants me to come back to St. Louis with nothing and nowhere to go and accept whatever arrangement he decides to offer. She paused. He's the kind of man who can't tolerate someone simply leaving. It's a matter of how he sees himself. That a woman could just go. That's not allowable. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Does he know you're here, on the mountain? Not yet, she said. I think, if he knew, we'd already be having a different conversation. Then we have some time. She looked at him. Gideon, I'm not sending you to town, he said. He said it simply, like it was a thing that had already been decided. I want to be clear about that before you start thinking about whether to argue. She felt something tighten in her chest, not unhappily. You don't know what he's capable of. You just told me what he's capable of, he said. A man who arranges consequences, who works through other people, who uses money as a lever. He looked at her. I've known men like that. They're not unusual. They're just men with more resources than principles. He has lawyers, she said. He has contacts with judges in Missouri. He can make paperwork become a problem in ways that are very hard to fight if you don't have resources of your own. Then we'll need to be careful, Gideon said. Not afraid, careful. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the wall she'd understood him to have, the one she'd known since the beginning she couldn't expect him to take down quickly. She thought about how she'd been careful not to push, not to ask for more than he could give, not to build too much on foundations that were still provisional. She thought about him saying, "I'm not sending you to town," like it was simply a fact about the world. "All right," she said. "All right," he said, and picked up the harness again. What Evelyn had not anticipated was Ruth. She'd thought she had managed the situation. She'd told Gideon they'd agreed to be careful. She'd begun thinking through what careful looked like in practical terms. She had not thought about what Ruth had already heard in town, and how Ruth processed things, and what Ruth was capable of when she decided something was wrong. She found out on Saturday. Ruth came back from her weekly trip to town looking like a person carrying something heavy and hot, and she went straight to the kitchen and started working, vigorously, the way she worked when she was angry, and within 10 minutes she said without preamble, "I spoke to Mrs. Alderman." Evelyn set down what she was holding. "Ruth, she has an office in Harlan's Creek," Ruth said. She was scrubbing the pot with considerable force. "She came out this way last month for something. I wrote to her 2 weeks ago when I heard the gossip." "You wrote to her without telling me." "I was going to tell you." Ruth turned around. She had the particular expression of someone who knows they've overstepped and has decided to own it. "I'm telling you now." Evelyn looked at her. She was not entirely surprised. Ruth had been watching the gossip situation with the focused attention she brought to things that threatened her household, and apparently she'd decided independent action was warranted. "What did she say?" Evelyn said. Ruth set down the pot. She dried her hands and she came and sat at the table, and her face did something complicated. "She said Caleb Mercer came to her a month before you arrived," Ruth said. She said he seemed agitated. He wanted to know everything about you. She didn't think much of it at the time. She said a lot of men ask questions about the women they're considering." She paused. "She said he asked very specific questions about your medical history, about documents." "Did she give him anything?" "She says she didn't." Ruth's voice was careful. "She says she only shared what you'd authorized her to share. But she said he already seemed to know things. He was asking about specifics she hadn't told him. He was confirming, not discovering." The confirmation settled into Evelyn's chest like something cold. She'd been right. She'd hoped she was wrong. "She was upset," Ruth continued, "when I told her what had happened, how he'd handled it, the gossip. She said she wanted you to know she was sorry." "That's kind of her," Evelyn said, which was not really what she felt, but was the most useful thing she could say. "There's more." Ruth looked at her hands. "I asked around while I was in town. I talked to Mr. Pratt. He runs the livery. He sees everyone who comes through. And I described a man. A particular kind of man, well-dressed for this territory. City clothes. Maybe a month or 6 weeks ago." Evelyn felt the cold thing spread. "He remembered him," Ruth said. "A man from back east," he said. "Came through on a private carriage, not the stage. Asked about the Mercer Ranch. Asked about a woman arriving on the September coach." She looked up at Evelyn. "He didn't give a name, but Mr. Pratt said he gave him something for the information. A generous something. Victor Langford, or one of his people. He rarely did legwork himself. But the same thing." Evelyn sat very still. "He was here," she said, "before I arrived. Before Mercer even—" She stopped. "This was arranged before I even got here, the whole thing." Ruth nodded. "Ruth?" The totality of it landed on her then, not just the mechanics, but the meaning of it. That she had traveled 7 days toward a future that had already been dismantled before she arrived. That Caleb Mercer hadn't made a decision about her at all. He'd been handed one. The rejection in the dirt path. The pale eyes and the flat voice and the 2 men on the porch. None of it had been about her specifically. She'd just been the figure standing in the right spot when the whole thing was triggered. She sat with this for a long moment. Then something else moved through her, coming in underneath the cold thing, warmer and harder. Not hurt, not fear. Something with more edge to it. "Is there anything else?" she asked. Ruth hesitated. "Mrs. Colton, the woman who told me about the gossip, she said people in town were starting to ask questions. About Mercer, not about you." She was watching Evelyn carefully. "She said the story about you about the deception. It wasn't sitting right with everyone. She said a few people had noticed that there had been other women, other arrangements that ended badly. And now with this one starting to look managed, people were beginning to wonder." "Wonder what?" Ruth was quiet for a moment, then, whether Caleb Mercer is capable of children himself. The kitchen was very still. It's just talk, Ruth said. Mrs. Colton didn't say it as fact, but she said there's a woman, a widow named Agnes Park, who lived near the Mercer place 2 years ago, who has said things to certain people that... She stopped. She never had it confirmed, but she said things. Evelyn thought about Caleb Mercer's voice, a condition that makes bearing children unlikely or impossible. She thought about how specifically he'd known what to say, how ready the accusation had been. A man who knew exactly what language to use because he'd been looking for the language first. A man who'd been given, or gone looking for, a medical document with precise phrasing because he needed ammunition, because he knew he was going to need to put the problem somewhere. Because the problem was his, and he'd needed somewhere to put it. He used my condition to cover his own, she said, quietly. Not to Ruth exactly, just to the room, assembling it out loud. Ruth didn't say anything. He couldn't have children, Evelyn said, or was afraid he couldn't, and he needed to end the arrangement in a way that made me the reason. So he found my medical history, and he used it. She stopped. Which means Langford didn't set this up. Or not entirely. Langford found out I was coming here, and he found Mercer. He found a man with his own reason to need a story, and he gave him the tool to tell it. She stood up. She went to the window. The mountain was out there, the clear autumn sky above it, the aspens along the creek gone gold. She thought about standing in a dirt path with her bag on her arm being told she wasn't acceptable. She thought about all the weight she'd given that moment, the humiliation of it, the way she'd turned it over in the weeks since and felt the shape of it, the particular damage of being found wanting in public. She thought about this fact that it had been constructed, that the hands that had built it hadn't even belonged to the man who'd done the delivering. She was angry. She'd been angry before in her life, but this was a particular quality of anger, the kind that comes from understanding something completely for the first time and finding that the understanding doesn't make it smaller. Evelyn. Ruth was behind her. Her voice was careful. I'm all right, Evelyn said. You don't have to be. I know. She turned around. Ruth was watching her with those careful eyes that had seen too much and learned to measure things precisely. I'm angry, Evelyn said, because Ruth had earned the truth. I'm very angry, but I'm not going to fall apart about it. I know, Ruth said. That's not what I meant. Evelyn looked at her. This girl, this 17 years of a girl, she'd had a birthday 2 weeks ago, she was 17 now, who had written a letter to a stranger in another town and asked the right questions, and ridden to town and talked to the right people and come home with pieces of a puzzle that Evelyn hadn't even known she was trying to solve. Thank you, Evelyn said. Ruth shrugged, which was her version of you're welcome. Someone had to. She told Gideon that evening. All of it. The arranged rejection, the planted story, the confirmation that Langford had been in the territory before she'd arrived. She told him in the straightforward way she'd found worked best with him, without preamble and without softening, and he listened the way he always listened, fully and without interruption, with the harness in his hands that he wasn't working. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Langford got to Mercer before you arrived, he said. Yes. Which means he knew your plans before you'd executed them. Mrs. Alderman's service, she said. He had access to her correspondence somehow. He knew who I was matched with and where the ranch was. Gideon was quiet again. Then, and now Mercer is spreading a story about you that he had help building. Mercer has his own reasons, she said. He's not Langford's instrument. He had something he wanted covered. But yes, they served each other's purposes. And Langford, his voice was level. He knows you're not at Mercer's place. He'll know by now. Does he know where you are? I don't know, she said honestly. Not yet, I think. Ruth's inquiries in town were discreet, but... She stopped. He doesn't stop. That's what you need to understand about him. He does not stop, and he does not do things loudly. He just waits and works until the ground shifts under you. She looked at Gideon. I know this is not what you took on when you opened your door in the rain. He looked back at her. Something moved in his face, not impatience, Not the particular careful distance he sometimes had. Something more open. I opened my door because a woman was going to be caught out in the mountain in a storm, he said. What I took on is everything that came through the door with her. She held his gaze. We have time, he said. You said he works carefully, not quickly. He'll be trying to locate you, and that takes time in this territory. So we use the time. To do what? To be better prepared than he expects. He set the harness down. The gossip about you in town, that needs answering, not with more gossip, with facts. Ruth found Mrs. Alderman. Mrs. Alderman knows something. Agnes Park knows something about Mercer. Facts, properly placed, travel. Evelyn looked at him. You're not suggesting I take this to Mercer himself. No, he said. I'm suggesting that the truth has a better chance than you think, if it has a few good people willing to carry it. He paused. You've been here 6 weeks. In that time you've fed my children and taught them and fixed what was broken in this house. People in Harlan's Creek know Ruth. They know Thomas. When the Walkers speak for someone in this town, that means something. I don't want you to put your family standing at risk because of Evelyn. His voice was even but firm. Stop trying to handle this alone. That's done. She looked at him. You're not the woman who came through the gate at Mercer's ranch anymore, he said. You haven't been for a long time. You're part of this family. My family has a stake in this. He paused. Let us have it. She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about this version of herself that had stood in that dirt path and said, I don't want your fare, and walked out through the gate and into the storm. That woman had been right to walk out. But she'd been walking towards something she didn't have yet, a place where she wasn't alone in what she was fighting. She was there now. All right, she said. He nodded. Outside the window, the mountain dark was settling in, the stars coming clear above the peaks the way they did out here, without any city light to compete with them. Inside, the fire was going. Somewhere upstairs, one of the children laughed at something and was shushed by someone else, and the house settled back into its evening quiet. He'll come eventually, she said. Langford. When he finds out where I am, he'll come. I expect he will, Gideon said. He won't come looking for a fight, she said. He doesn't do that. He'll come with lawyers and paperwork and something that looks entirely legitimate. Then we'll need to be ready for lawyers and paperwork, Gideon said. She almost smiled. It surprised her. The almost. The way something that was not remotely funny could produce something in her that was almost a smile. You've never dealt with a man like Langford, she said. No, he said. But I've spent 15 years running a ranch in the Montana Territory with no help and very little money and a lot of things trying to go wrong. I'm not easy to move. She believed him. Looking at this man, this weathered, plain-spoken, imperfect man who held his household together by sheer consistency and who had just said, let us have it, like it was the simplest thing in the world, she believed him entirely. Go to bed, he said. There's a lot of work tomorrow, and most problems look smaller in daylight. She stood up. She paused. Gideon, she said. He looked up. Mercer was wrong about me, she said. But he was also hiding that he was wrong about himself. And there are 2 women before me who were sent away with the same story attached to their names. She said it quietly, steadily. I'm not going to let that stand anymore. Whatever comes from Langford, that's a separate thing. But the story Mercer built, the one he used on me and used before me, that needs to be taken apart. Gideon looked at her for a long moment, and in his face she saw something she hadn't seen there before. Not admiration exactly, but recognition. The look of one person seeing another person clearly. Then we'll take it apart, he said. She went to bed. The mountain was quiet outside, and the stars were very bright, and somewhere in the distance a coyote made its thin, wavering sound and went silent. In the morning there would be breakfast and children and work and the ordinary machinery of a life that was, against all reasonable expectation, continuing to function. And underneath all of that, present now in a way it hadn't been before, real in a way she hadn't let herself make it, there was the knowledge that she was not in this alone, that there were people in this house who had a stake in her, who had chosen to have it, and who were not in the habit of abandoning things they'd chosen. It was not a small thing. She closed her eyes in the dark, and she let it be not a small thing. Victor Langford arrived on a Wednesday. Evelyn knew before she saw him. She knew the way you know a storm is coming before the clouds arrive. Something in the quality of the air, something that had changed in the 2 days before without being nameable. A rider had come up the mountain Monday, asking questions at the lower gate, or so Thomas reported when he came back from checking the fence line. He described the man as well-dressed and polite and not local, and the questions had been about who lived on the property and how long. Thomas had said he didn't know anything, which was both true and not true in the way that a 14-year-old boy can manage when he's paying attention. On Tuesday, Ruth came back from town tight-faced and said that a man had been at the hotel in Harlan's Creek since Saturday, that he'd asked about properties in the area, that he'd had a conversation with Sheriff Aldous, which nobody had overheard, but which people had noticed. On Wednesday morning, Evelyn told Gideon, and Gideon said, "How much time do we have?" "Today," she said. "Maybe." He nodded and went out to the barn, and she didn't ask what he was doing because she'd learned to trust his preparation even when she couldn't see the shape of it. He came at midday. 2 horses, 1 carriage, a driver who stayed with the horses. Victor Langford came up the path to the cabin door alone, which was characteristic. He had never needed people around him to feel powerful, had always preferred to work in the space between just himself and whoever he was addressing. He was a man of about 50, well-built in the way of men who had once been physically strong and had since gone to something softer, but still carried the frame of it. His clothes were Eastern, good wool, clean, a quality that stood out in the mountain afternoon like a piece of furniture in the wrong room. His face was pleasant in the abstract way of faces that had never needed to be particularly revealing. He had learned, somewhere along the way, to wear his intentions the way he wore his clothes, well-fitted, presenting well, concealing the working parts. Evelyn opened the door before he knocked. He stopped. A brief recalibration. She'd seen it before. That fraction of a second when he encountered something outside his prediction. He recovered quickly. "Evelyn," he said, pleasantly. "You're well." "Mr. Langford," she said. She did not move back from the doorway. He looked at the cabin behind her, the mountain above it, the October sky. His expression managed to convey something between concern and condescension without committing fully to either. "I've been looking for you," he said. "I was worried." "I doubt that," she said. "You left St. Louis without any forwarding address. Your friends were concerned." "I didn't have many friends in St. Louis by the time I left," she said. "You saw to that." The pleasant expression didn't change. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." She kept her voice level. She had decided in the preparation she'd done over the past 2 days, not out loud, just inside herself, the private assembly of resolve, that she was not going to be afraid of him. She was not going to pretend not to be afraid, which was a different thing. She was actually not going to be afraid because fear was what he used, and she was not going to give him the material. "What do you want, Mr. Langford?" He smiled. It was a practice smile, the kind that didn't reach anything above the mouth. "I came to help," he said. "You've been through a difficult experience. That man Mercer treated you shamefully. I heard about it, and I was—" "You arranged it," she said. The smile held. "That's a serious accusation. It's an accurate one. You obtained a medical document that belonged to me. You gave it, or the contents of it, to Caleb Mercer before I arrived. You arranged for him to use it in the most public way possible." She watched his face. "I can't prove all of it yet, but I know the shape of it, and so do you." Langford looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "May I come in?" "No," she said. Behind her, she heard boots on the stairs. Thomas, coming down from where she'd asked him to stay until she called for him. In her peripheral vision, she could see Gideon coming around the corner of the barn, unhurried, wiping his hands on a rag. Langford's eyes moved to Gideon. Something shifted in his assessment. "Your situation here," he said, redirecting, "is precarious. You're living in another man's house without formal arrangement. That looks a particular way to people." The pleasant tone was exactly the same. "In Missouri, there are legal questions about property you left behind when you departed. Certain items that belong to—" "There is no property," Evelyn said. "I left nothing that belonged to anyone else." "There are questions about that," Langford said. "A complaint has been filed." And there it was. The paperwork Gideon had predicted. Not loud, not violent. Just a piece of legal machinery quietly set in motion, designed to make her situation complicated and expensive and exhausting. "What complaint?" she said. A jewelry piece. A brooch that belonged to Margaret Hartwell. She says you borrowed it and never returned it. He was watching her face very carefully. It's a small matter, easily resolved if you were willing to come back to St. Louis and sort it out. She stared at him. Margaret Hartwell was a woman she'd worked for briefly 2 years ago. The brooch? Evelyn remembered the brooch. A small pearl thing. Remembered setting it back on Margaret's dressing table before she'd finished her last week of work there. She remembered it precisely because she'd known, even then, that accusations of that kind were easy to make and hard to disprove. She'd known. She'd been careful. She'd put the brooch down in plain sight, and she'd thought, I'm covered. Except that Margaret Hartwell owed Victor Langford a considerable sum on a property loan, and that changed the arithmetic entirely. Gideon had reached the porch. He came to stand beside Evelyn, not in front of her, beside her, and he looked at Langford with the same level, assessing expression he brought to fence problems and livestock issues, something that needed understanding before it could be addressed. This is the man? Gideon said, not to Langford, to Evelyn. Yes, she said. Langford looked at Gideon with the particular look of a man recalculating something he'd thought was simple. Mr. Walker, is it? I don't have a quarrel with you. This is a matter between me and Miss Hart. Mrs. Evelyn is part of my household, Gideon said. His voice was even and completely without heat, which was somehow more authoritative than anger would have been. That makes it a matter that concerns me. You're not married, Langford said. She has no legal standing in your household. Any arrangement you've made is informal, and Mr. Langford, Gideon's voice didn't rise. You've come a long way to deliver a message. You've delivered it. Now I'd like you to get back in your carriage and go down the mountain, and we'll deal with whatever legal matter you've set in motion through the appropriate channels. Langford looked at him for a moment. The pleasant expression had thinned, not disappeared, but thinned the way ice thins when the temperature is higher than expected. The complaint has been filed in Missouri, Langford said. A warrant can be issued. If it is, she'll need to go back and answer it. And the costs involved, we'll get a lawyer, Gideon said. Mr. Walker. Langford's voice carried the patient tone of a man explaining something to someone who doesn't understand the power dynamics. A lawyer in Montana Territory is of limited use against a warrant filed in Missouri. The costs of fighting this from here would be considerable. I'm trying to offer a simpler solution. I'm sure you are, Gideon said. Get in your carriage. He left. Not happily, but he left. Because there was nothing else to do in the face of a man who was simply not going to be moved by the levers Langford knew how to pull. Money leverage didn't work on a man who'd been operating without money for years. Social leverage didn't work on a man who lived 3 miles up a mountain. Evelyn watched the carriage go down the road and felt the complicated knot of her chest not loosen exactly, but shift. He'll do it, she said. The warrant. I know, Gideon said. If a warrant comes from Missouri, Sheriff Aldous will have to act on it. She turned to look at him. He's not a bad man, Aldous. I've heard he's fair. But fair doesn't help if the paperwork is legitimate. Then we need to get ahead of the paperwork. He was already moving toward the door. I need to write a letter today. To who? My brother, he said. He's a lawyer in Helena. She stopped. You have a brother who's a lawyer. He's not a very good lawyer, Gideon said, and she heard in his voice the particular quality of old sibling history. But he knows people who are, and Helena's closer than Missouri. The letter went out that afternoon with Thomas writing down to the post office himself and instructed not to stop for anything. Evelyn had helped draft it. Gideon knew the law better than she'd expected from a man who lived 3 miles up a mountain, and they sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and put together something that laid out the situation without excess. The complaint in Missouri. Langford's history of systematic pressure. The medical document that had been obtained and used without her consent. The connection to Mercer. The pattern. She wrote it out and she looked at it on the page and she thought, this is my life, reduced to evidence. It was a strange feeling, clarifying in a way she hadn't expected. Ruth had put the children to bed. All of them. even James without argument, because the children had felt the weight in the house all day and had been uncharacteristically cooperative in the way children sometimes are when they understand something important is happening and decide, without being asked, to help by staying out of the way. May had gone down without protest. Even Joseph had come downstairs before Evelyn could call him and done the dishes without being asked, standing at the basin with his quiet, focused attention and washing every plate twice. "They know something's wrong," Gideon said. "Children always know," Evelyn said. "What do we tell them?" She thought about this. She'd been thinking about it all day, actually. The children and what was owed to them in terms of honesty versus protection, and where the line was. "The truth," she said. "Not all of it at once, but enough of the shape of it that they're not frightened by what they can't name." She looked at him. "They've had enough of things they couldn't name." He looked at her for a moment. "You mean since their mother?" "Yes." He was quiet, then, "All right, in the morning." "Os." In the morning, he told them himself, not the full complexity, not Langford's name or the specific legal mechanics, but the shape of it. He sat them at the breakfast table, and he said that there was a man from Evelyn's past who was trying to make trouble, and that they were dealing with it, and that everything was going to be handled, but it might be a tense few weeks. He said it in the same voice he used to explain why a particular fence section needed replacing, or why they'd be eating beans 3 times this week because the supply run hadn't gone well. The voice that treated problems as things to be addressed, not catastrophes to be feared. James said, "What kind of trouble?" "Legal trouble," Gideon said. "Can he take Evelyn away?" A pause. Evelyn kept her hands around her coffee cup. "He's going to try," Gideon said. "We're not going to let him." James absorbed this with his characteristic efficiency and then said, "What do we do?" "You go to school," Gideon said. "You do your work. You don't talk to strangers about what happens in this house. You trust that the adults are handling it." James thought about this for approximately 4 seconds and then said, "Is the lawyer from Helena going to help?" Evelyn looked at Gideon. "I was in the main room," James said without apology, "when you were writing the letter." "Yes," Gideon said with the flat patience of a man who had raised this boy for 10 years. "The lawyer is going to help. Eat your breakfast." Ruth caught Evelyn's eye across the table. In Ruth's expression was something that was both concerned and, underneath it, the resolute quality of a girl who had made up her mind about something and was waiting for the right moment. That moment came 2 days later. She came to Evelyn on a Thursday afternoon, out in the kitchen garden, where Evelyn was putting the last of the season's vegetables by before the frost came. She said, "I wrote to Agnes Park." Evelyn straightened up slowly. "Ruth?" "Before all this," Ruth said, "after the conversation with Mrs. Colton, I wrote to her because I thought—" She stopped. "I thought someone should." She was holding a piece of paper, folded, and she held it out. She wrote back. Evelyn took the letter. Agnes Park was not a woman given to elaborate writing. Her letter was 3 paragraphs, and it said what it said with the plainness of someone who had been holding something for a long time and had decided, when asked directly, to simply put it down. She wrote that she had been acquainted with Caleb Mercer for several years. She wrote that she had known his wife, who had died of fever, and that in the years before her death there had been questions, not public ones, not spoken aloud, but the kind of questions that live in the spaces between what people say and what they know, about why after 8 years of marriage there were no children. She wrote that Caleb Mercer had visited a physician in a town 30 miles away, not the local doctor, which people noticed in a small territory. She wrote that she did not know what the physician had told him, but that she knew the visit had happened and that shortly afterward Mercer's behavior had changed in ways she couldn't describe precisely, but that several people had observed. And she wrote in this last paragraph, "I have said some of this to some people over the years and been told I should keep it to myself. I am not a young woman anymore, and I am tired of keeping things to myself when keeping them serves no one but people who have treated others poorly. If what I know is useful to someone who has been harmed by Caleb Mercer's need to protect himself at another person's expense, then I am willing to say it in whatever setting is required." Evelyn folded the letter. "She's willing to speak," Ruth said. "Formally, if it comes to that." "This could make things difficult for her," Evelyn said. "In town, Mercer has friends. I mentioned that in my letter, Ruth said. She wrote back anyway. Evelyn looked at this girl, this 17-year-old girl who had written letters and asked questions and ridden to town and followed threads that she hadn't been asked to follow because she had decided in her own quiet way that things needed to be set right. Thank you, Evelyn said. Don't thank me yet, Ruth said. We still have Langford's warrant to deal with. The warrant arrived on a Friday. Sheriff Aldous came up the mountain himself, which was, she thought, his way of being decent about it. Sending a deputy would have been easier for him, but he came himself, and he came in the morning rather than at night. And he took his hat off when Evelyn opened the door. He was a man of about 55, lean and fair, with the weathered competence of someone who'd done hard work in hard country for a long time. He'd been sheriff in Harlan's Creek for 12 years, and in 12 years he'd developed the particular quality of a man who had seen a lot of human behavior and had organized his understanding of it around the simple question of who was actually causing harm. Miss Hart, he said, I've received a warrant out of Missouri. Allegation of theft, a piece of jewelry, a brooch. He looked at her steadily. I want you to know that I've also received a letter from Daniel Walker in Helena advising me that this warrant is part of a pattern of legal harassment originating with a Victor Langford of St. Louis and requesting a postponement of any action pending legal review. Gideon appeared in the doorway behind Evelyn. Sheriff, he said. Walker. Aldous looked at them both. He had the expression of a man who had made up his mind about something and was working out the best way to execute it. I'm required to serve this. I want to be clear about that. The warrant is a formal document from a Missouri court, and I can't simply ignore it. He paused. But a postponement pending legal review is not unusual. I'm prepared to give you 2 weeks before I'm required to act further, which gives Daniel Walker time to file what he needs to file. 2 weeks, Evelyn said. 2 weeks, he confirmed, in which time I would ask that you remain in the territory. He paused again. Miss Hart, I'm going to speak plainly. I've heard the gossip about you and Caleb Mercer. I've also heard some other things recently, through various channels, that make that gossip look considerably less reliable than it was presented. He put his hat back on. 2 weeks. Get your lawyer moving. He turned and went back down the path to his horse. Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched him go. 2 weeks, Gideon said. Daniel Walker better be as well connected as you think, she said. He's not particularly well connected, Gideon said, but he owes me 11 years of back help on this ranch, and he knows it. The next 10 days were the most exhausting of Evelyn's life, and her life had included a 7-day stagecoach journey to a disaster, which she had previously considered a high benchmark. Daniel Walker arrived from Helena on the 3rd day. He was shorter than Gideon and considerably more talkative, with the quick eyes of a man who processed information rapidly and the slightly rumpled quality of someone who had spent most of his adult life indoors. He was not, as Gideon had said, a very good lawyer. He himself admitted this cheerfully within the first hour, saying he mostly handled land disputes and the occasional contract disagreement, and that criminal warrants from out of state were outside his usual work. But he knew people, and he'd made calls. He sat at the kitchen table on his first evening and laid out what he'd found, with Evelyn and Gideon on the other side of the table and Ruth sitting just slightly outside the main circle of lamplight, present but quiet, which was her version of being part of something. The warrant is real, Daniel said. Margaret Hartwell did file a complaint in St. Louis, but the complaint was filed 5 weeks ago, which is interesting. He looked at Evelyn. 5 weeks ago, you'd been in Montana Territory for 4 weeks. Someone filed that complaint knowing you were not in Missouri and could not easily respond. Langford, Evelyn said. Almost certainly. The question is whether he pressured Hartwell or whether she did it voluntarily. He folded his hands on the table. I've spoken to a colleague in St. Louis who knows the Hartwell family. He tells me that Margaret Hartwell has had financial difficulties this past year, a property loan that's come due that she's struggling to pay. He paused. The loan is held by Victor Langford's investment company. Gideon said nothing. His expression said enough. So she filed a false complaint against me to satisfy a debt, Evelyn said. We can't prove it's false without the brooch itself, Daniel said. Do you know? I put it on her dressing table, Evelyn said. I put it there deliberately in view of her housekeeper. I remember the housekeeper's name. I remember exactly where I said it. Daniel's eyebrows went up. You remember the housekeeper? Her name is Dorothea Crane, Evelyn said. She'd been with the Hartwells for 9 years. She was meticulous. She would know what was on that dressing table. She looked at Daniel. If someone asked her. Daniel wrote something down. I'll contact my colleague in St. Louis. He paused. There's something else. The medical document. The one Mercer used. Do you know how Langford got it? Mrs. Alderman's correspondence. I think he had access to her office somehow. I've spoken to Mrs. Alderman myself, Ruth said, from her position at the edge of the lamplight. Both men looked at her. She looked back at them with the equanimity of someone who is used to being underestimated. She told me that 18 months ago a man came to her office, claiming to be a legal representative checking credentials for an arrangement. She let him look at her files. She thought it was routine. She says she would recognize him if she saw him again. Daniel stared at Ruth for a moment. Then he looked at Gideon. She's 17? She'll be 18 in March, Gideon said. Daniel looked back at Ruth. Can she come to Helena? No, Gideon said, at the same time that Ruth said, yes. They looked at each other. She's not going alone, Gideon said. I'll take Thomas, Ruth said. We'd be back in 4 days. Evelyn did not sleep well during those 4 days. She slept in the way you sleep when there's too much in your head to go quiet. You drop in and out, you register sounds, you feel the house around you, the breathing of it, the children asleep upstairs. She lay in the dark, and she thought about Dorothea Crane in St. Louis, and whether Daniel's colleague would find her, and whether she would remember a brooch on a dressing table 2 years ago, and whether memory of that kind held up in legal proceedings. She thought about Agnes Park and her 3 plain paragraphs and the line, I'm tired of keeping things to myself when keeping them serves no one. She thought about the shape of the trap she'd been in without knowing it. Langford on one side, Mercer on the other, herself in the middle of something constructed before she'd arrived. She thought about what it meant to have been maneuvered like that, and how long it would have continued if she'd simply gone back to St. Louis, and whether that was still a thing that could happen. And she thought about the fact that she was lying in this house and not in St. Louis. That she was here, 3 miles up Whitmore's mountain, with 9 children asleep above her, and a man downstairs who had said, we're not going to let him, as if it were simply a statement of fact. On the second night, she got up. She didn't know why exactly. She just couldn't stay in the dark with her own thoughts anymore. She put on her shawl and she went to the main room, and Gideon was there, which didn't surprise her. He hadn't been sleeping well either. She could tell by the sounds in the house, the slight creak of the floorboards that meant he was up and moving. He was at the table with a cup of coffee and the lamplight, and no particular pretense of doing anything else. She sat down across from him. For a while, neither of them said anything. The fire had burned to coals and the room was dim and warm, and outside the mountain wind was doing its usual work in the pines. What if it doesn't work? She said. Not a question exactly, more an acknowledgement of a possibility she'd been carrying. Then we deal with what's next, he said. If the warrant proceeds, if Aldous has to act, Daniel is not going to let that happen, Gideon said. He's many things, my brother, but he's stubborn when he's invested in something, and he's invested. Because you called in a debt. Because he thinks it's wrong, Gideon said. He told me so. He said, and these are Daniel's words, not mine, that any man who uses lawyers the way other men use fists is a coward, and that he has made it a personal point of principle to annoy men like that. He paused. He's got a particular set of principles, my brother. They're not always practical, but they're real. She almost smiled. There it was again, that almost. Gideon, she said. He looked at her. Whatever happens with the warrant, whatever Langford manages to make happen. She stopped. She started again. I need you to know that I'm not going back. Not to St. Louis, not to the situation I was in. Whatever it costs to fight this, I'm going to fight it. She held his gaze. I'm telling you because you have a right to know what you're part of. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be fast. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I know all that. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. He was quiet. He turned the cup in his hands. He had the look he got when he was working up to something difficult. Not because he was afraid of it, but because he was honest, and honesty sometimes meant taking time. Evelyn, he said. She waited. I've been thinking about this for a while, he said. Since before all this started. Since before Langford's name came into it. He looked at the table, then at her. I told you weeks ago that I wanted you here as part of this family. I meant that. But I mean it more specifically than I said it then." He stopped. "I'm asking you to marry me." The room was very quiet. "Not because of the legal situation," he said quickly, and she heard the urgency of it, the need to make sure she understood that. "I want to be clear, not because it makes things easier, though it does, because you have been the center of this house for 3 months, and I have watched you be that. I have watched you with my children and with Ruth, and I have sat across this table from you more nights than I can count, and I have—" He stopped. He was not a man who assembled feelings into words easily, and right now he was pushing against that limitation, and she could see it costing him. "I care about you," he said finally. That's not the whole of it, but it's the true part of it, and I mean it." She looked at him. She thought about the fork in the road. She thought about wrong turns and where they led. She thought about Hannah's hand, and Joseph quietly helping his sister with her reading, and Ruth, who wrote letters and asked questions, and had 17 years of courage in her, and James, who'd reorganized the woodpile like it was a matter of honor. She thought about this man, this imperfect, plain-spoken, weathered man who held things together by being consistent and who hadn't asked her about Caleb Mercer's rejection because he hadn't needed to, because it was her business to share when she chose to, and he understood that. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face changed, not dramatically, not in the way things change in stories, just a small, real shift, like a door that had been almost closed moving to open. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Ruth and Thomas came back from Helena on the 4th day. They came in the late afternoon with the look of people who had traveled hard and accomplished something. Ruth put her bag down and said, "Dorothea Crane remembers the brooch." Evelyn sat very still. "She's been the Hartwell housekeeper for 11 years, Ruth said. "Daniel's colleague found her in a day. She remembers the brooch on the dressing table because she was the one who put it in the jewelry box afterward, and she can describe exactly where it was and when." "Mom says She paused. "She also says that 2 months ago Mrs. Hartwell asked her whether she remembered a woman named Evelyn Hart borrowing the brooch, and she said she told Mrs. Hartwell the same thing she told Daniel's colleague, that she'd never seen anyone borrow it and that she'd put it back herself." "Hartwell asked her," Evelyn said, "before the complaint was filed." "Yes," Ruth said, "and filed it anyway." Daniel arrived the following morning with a document that established, through Dorothea Crane's sworn statement and the testimony of Mrs. Alderman regarding the unauthorized access to her files, that the complaint against Evelyn was without factual foundation, and that the circumstances surrounding its filing suggested improper influence. He rode to Aldis's office himself and presented it. The warrant was suspended pending review. Victor Langford left Harlan's Creek on Thursday. He did not leave quietly. There were reports from the hotel of a scene of some kind, raised voices, a very cold conversation between Langford and the hotel proprietor, who had apparently decided, after a week of the man's residency and a number of conversations with various locals, that he was not a guest he wished to continue hosting. But he left. His carriage went east on the main road, and nobody in Harlan's Creek watched it go with any particular regret. Evelyn heard about it from Clara, who had heard about it from the girl who sat next to her at school, whose mother ran the hotel, and Clara reported it with the triumphant detail of someone who had been personally offended by the man's existence and was satisfied by his departure. "He looked angry," Clara said. "Mrs. Poole said he had an expression like something gone sour." "Clara," Evelyn said, "I'm just reporting what I heard." "I know." Evelyn kept her face straight. "Go finish your arithmetic." Clara went. At the table, James, who had also apparently heard this report and was similarly satisfied, did his arithmetic with an extra measure of self-congratulatory energy. Joseph, quiet as always, looked up from his own work and looked at Evelyn. In his dark, serious eyes, she saw something that wasn't quite a smile, something smaller, more private than that. And then he looked back down at his slate. She looked around the kitchen, the fire going. Hannah beside William on the bench, their heads bent together over a picture book. Clara and James at the table. May in the corner assembling something out of wooden blocks that kept collapsing and being rebuilt. Through the window, the October mountain, the aspens stripped now, the peaks white, the sky a clean, hard blue. She thought Langford will not leave this alone forever. This is not over. He will find another approach, another angle, another piece of paperwork. And then she thought, and when he does, we will deal with that too. Something had shifted. Not in the situation. The situation remained complicated, and Mercer's gossip still circulated in parts of town, and Daniel had told her clearly that the Missouri matter would likely require further legal response before it was fully resolved. Not in any of that. In her. In the part of her that had been, for longer than she could remember, doing the algebra of how much she was worth and coming up short. She was not alone in this. That was the thing. That was the shift. She was not the woman standing at the edge of a drawing room watching other people get chosen. She was not the woman at the fork in the rain trying to figure out alone which direction led somewhere survivable. She was here. She was part of this. And there were people in this house, imperfect, complicated, occasionally infuriating people with woodpile opinions, and 11 years of accumulated sibling debt, and 17-year-old courage and small feverish hands that held on in the night, who had a stake in her and had chosen to have it. When Gideon came in at dusk, cold from the fence work, she handed him coffee without being asked, and he took it without ceremony, and they stood side by side at the kitchen window while the mountain went dark, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. The children made noise behind them. The fire kept going. Outside, the first stars appeared over the ridge, cold and clear and very far away. She was still here. The Missouri matter was not resolved quickly. Daniel had warned her it wouldn't be, and Daniel, for all his cheerful self-deprecation about his legal abilities, turned out to know what he was talking about. The formal review of the complaint took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of letters moving back and forth between Helena and St. Louis, of Dorothea Crane's sworn statement being submitted and challenged and resubmitted with additional documentation, of Daniel making 2 trips to Helena and 1 to a circuit judge in Billings who had the authority to formally dismiss the warrant. 6 weeks of Evelyn going about her days. The fire, the oats, the children, the fence accounts, the kitchen garden put properly to bed for the winter, while somewhere in a filing office in Missouri, a bureaucratic machinery ground through the evidence of her life. She had decided early on that she was not going to let the waiting hollow her out. That was what waiting was designed to do when someone like Langford set it in motion. Not the legal outcome itself, but the corrosive weight of the uncertainty, the way it sat on your chest at 2 a.m. and made everything feel provisional. She had felt that weight in St. Louis for 2 years, and she recognized it for what it was now, and she refused to feed it. So she lived. She did the work of the days, and she let the days accumulate, and she held on to the fact that the ground under her feet was more solid than it had ever been. She and Gideon had said very little to the children about the marriage yet, not because they were hiding it. She didn't believe in hiding things from children. They always knew anyway. They read the air of a household with a precision that adults underestimated. But because they had agreed quietly that some things deserved the right moment, and the right moment was not in the middle of a legal dispute with an outcome still uncertain. There was something in her that didn't want to attach the announcement to the fight. She wanted it separate, clean. Ruth knew. Ruth had known before they told her, which was not surprising. When, Ruth had asked, the morning after, in the kitchen, with the plain directness she applied to everything. When things settle, Evelyn had said. Ruth had looked at her for a moment with those careful eyes. Don't wait too long, she said. The children need something to look forward to. Then she'd gone back to her work, and Evelyn had stood in the kitchen with the warmth of that in her chest. The children need something to look forward to. And thought that this girl, this 17-year-old girl who had been carrying too much for too long, had somewhere along the way quietly shifted from doing what was necessary to doing what was generous. The formal dismissal came on a Tuesday in December. Daniel rode up the mountain himself to deliver it, which Evelyn suspected was because he wanted to see his brother's face when it arrived rather than simply because the message required personal delivery. The document said, in the dense and impersonal language of legal proceedings, that the complaint filed by Margaret Hartwell had been found to be without evidentiary foundation and was dismissed. It said that evidence of improper influence in the filing of the complaint had been noted and referred to the Missouri Bar Association for review of the conduct of the attorney involved. Langford's attorney, Daniel explained, who had filed the complaint knowing the evidence was fabricated. It said that no further action would be taken against Evelyn Hart. She read it twice. She handed it to Gideon. He read it and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. And she watched his face do the thing it did when something important happened. That small, private shift, contained but real. Daniel said, "I'd like a meal, please. I've been on a horse since before dawn, and I'm substantially unhappy about it." Evelyn put the document down and went to the kitchen. She made the meal and she fed Daniel, who ate with the gratitude of a man genuinely relieved to be off a horse. And she listened to him tell Gideon about the proceedings with the talker's enjoyment of a story where he'd come out well. And she thought, it's done. The Missouri matter is done. Langford's lawyer was facing a bar review. Langford himself had, according to Daniel's St. Louis contact, been unusually quiet since his return. Not the dangerous quiet of a man planning something, Daniel assessed, but the quiet of a man who had miscalculated and was recalibrating. He would not be recalibrating toward Evelyn. Men like Langford moved on when the cost of a particular campaign exceeded its value, and the bar review had raised the cost considerably. She knew he might surface again someday. That was the honest truth, and she held it honestly. A man with his resources and his particular kind of pride did not simply forget, but he would be careful now, and careful meant slow, and slow meant she had time, real time, not the provisional kind she'd been living in. She thought about what she would do with real time. The Mercer matter resolved differently, not through courts or documents, but through the slower, less manageable process of what people choose to believe when they've had long enough to think about it. Agnes Park had been true to her word. She'd spoken, not in a dramatic public forum, but in the way that information actually travels in small territories, in the particular conversations that matter. She'd talked to Mrs. Colton, who talked to others still. The pattern of 3 rejected women, and Mercer's need in each case to make the problem theirs rather than his, had become visible enough in the light of Agnes's knowledge that people had begun to rearrange their understanding quietly and without announcement. Caleb Mercer was not run out of town. He was not publicly shamed. He continued to run his ranch and attend the occasional community gathering, and people continued to be civil to him in the way that small communities are civil to people they have complicated feelings about. But the story he'd told, the one about Evelyn's deception, had been set quietly aside, the way people set aside a version of events once they've come to believe a better one. Nobody apologized to Evelyn. That wasn't how it worked. But she noticed, on her trips to town with Ruth or the children, that Mrs. Colton asked after her directly, and that Mr. Pratt at the livery touched his hat, and that the particular quality of being seen in a place had changed. She had not spoken to Caleb Mercer since the day she'd walked out of his gate. She did not think she would. She was not angry at him anymore. Not in the hot, active way she'd been angry when she understood the full shape of what he'd done. It had cooled into something more like clarity. He was a man with a shame he'd been unable to own, and he'd put it on other people, and he'd damaged them for it. That was true, and it would remain true, and she was not going to spend her life carrying his portion of it. She had her own life to carry. It was a full one. She had enough. Nay. They were married in the first week of January, in the main room of the cabin on Whitmore's Mountain, with Daniel Walker officiating in his capacity as notary, and the 9 children arranged with varying degrees of ceremony around the room. James had somehow obtained a length of ribbon, she never found out where, and tied it to the chair near the fireplace that had been designated as the focal point of the proceedings. And when Evelyn had looked at it, he'd shrugged with the elaborately casual air of someone who had strong aesthetic opinions and preferred not to be asked about them. Joseph had polished the floorboards in the main room the day before without being asked or acknowledged, and they were noticeably cleaner than they had been, which was his version of preparation. Clara had made a cake, or attempted one, with Ruth's supervision and a considerable amount of confidence that somewhat exceeded her technical ability at the time, and it was lopsided, and the icing had run, but it was present, and it was sweet, and it was Clara's, which made it exactly right. Hannah had picked sprigs of pine from outside and put them in a jar on the mantelpiece. It was January, and there was not a great deal available in the way of ornament, but the pine was green, and it smelled like the mountain, and Evelyn thought it was the finest thing in the room. Nora stood beside Evelyn for the entire proceeding, which was expected, and held Evelyn's hand with the devoted grip she'd been perfecting for 4 months. May sat on Gideon's boot and fell asleep before it was over, which was also expected. Thomas stood beside his father with the quiet seriousness he brought to things that mattered. And Evelyn caught his eye once during Daniel's recitation, and he gave her a small, deliberate nod that was the most Thomas-like thing he could have done, and that meant more to her than he probably understood. She and Gideon said what they said to each other, and they meant it. And Daniel said the words that made it formal and legal and real. And Gideon's hand was rough and warm around hers, and he looked at her with that direct, serious gaze that never tried to be more than it was. And she thought, "This is not what I came here for." And then, "I know." And then quietly, underneath all of it, "And it is better." No. Spring came, as it always did on the mountain, later than you expected and more completely than you'd managed to hope for. The aspens came back along the creek. The cattle were in better condition than the previous year. The feed supplier had been changed in October, and Doc Prentice and Billings had confirmed by letter in February that the calves were coming through healthy, which was the quiet resolution of a problem that had been costing the ranch in ways that went beyond money. The household had reorganized itself around the new reality so naturally that it was hard to remember sometimes that there had been a time before it. That was not sentiment. It was simply the way living arrangements worked when they were actual rather than performed. Evelyn had never tried to be the children's mother in the sense of replacing something lost. She'd just been present, consistently, doing what needed doing, and presence had done the rest in its own time. Ruth had begun that spring to talk about a school. Not attending one, she'd been clear since January that she had no interest in going elsewhere, but starting one. There were children along the mountain road who had no reliable access to the school in town, and Ruth had spent a winter watching Evelyn teach the younger Walker children and had been developing, in her quiet, systematic way, a plan for something more organized. She brought it to Evelyn on a morning in March, with a handwritten outline and the expression of someone who had been working on something for months and was ready to see what another person thought of it. Evelyn read it carefully. It was good. It was better than good. It was practical. It understood what resources were available. It had thought through the problems of scheduling and materials and how to make the thing work in a community with limited time and limited money. It was the work of a girl who had an actual gift for organizing things and had been using it on a household for years and was ready to use it on something larger. "This is excellent," Evelyn said. Ruth waited because she knew there was more. "You'd need a space," Evelyn said. "The lower barn room if your father agrees, and you'd need at least one other adult to make it credible to parents." "I was going to ask you," Ruth said. "I know you were." Evelyn looked at the outline again. "And yes, whenever you're ready." Ruth took the paper back and held it with both hands, and something moved in her face that was not quite a smile. Something more internal than that, more private. The expression of a person who has just seen a thing they wanted become a thing that might actually happen. She was 17 years old, and she had spent 3 years being what her family needed her to be. And she was now, for the first time, beginning to build toward what she herself might become. Evelyn looked at her and felt the particular warmth of watching someone step from one version of themselves into a larger one. She had not come here to do that. She had come here because she'd taken the wrong fork in a road in a rainstorm and knocked on a door because it had light in it and found a household that needed someone steady. She hadn't come with a plan to give Ruth Walker a future or to give Thomas a reason to believe in his own intelligence or to give Hannah a person to sit with in the night. She'd just done the next thing, and then the next, and those things had turned out to matter. That was a truth she'd come to slowly over the months of this mountain life, but she held it solidly now. That the things you build without a plan, simply by showing up and doing the work of each day, are sometimes the most real things you ever build. Not because they're easy. They're not. Not because they're clean or uncomplicated or free of cost, but because they're made of actual days, actual effort, actual people choosing to be present with each other. And that kind of thing has a weight to it that nothing arranged or performed ever quite manages. She had been told, in various ways and by various people over the years, that she was not quite enough, not quite the right appearance, not quite the right history, not quite the right capacity. Caleb Mercer had said it with deliberate cruelty in a dirt path in front of witnesses. Victor Langford had said it through lawyers and fabricated complaints, and the slow machinery of a man who needed women to have no options. The drawing rooms of St. Louis had said it more quietly but no less consistently, in the particular silence that falls around a person who has been collectively assessed and found to be on the wrong side of some invisible line. She had carried that for a long time. She did not carry it anymore. Not because everything had worked out. She was too clear-eyed for that kind of revisionism. Things had not simply worked out. There had been the rainstorm and the wrong fork, and the 7 days on the coach toward a disaster, and Langford's cold, smooth face, and 6 weeks of legal uncertainty and the exhaustion of fighting something that should never have needed fighting. It had cost her. She was honest about what it had cost, but she had not been diminished by it. That was the thing she understood now that she hadn't understood at the start. The cost of a hard thing and the damage of a hard thing were not the same. You could pay for something fully and not be broken by it. You could be knocked sideways. Genuinely, not metaphorically, knocked all the way off the road you'd been on, and find that the road you landed on was truer. She had not known, standing in a dirt path being told she was not acceptable, that 3 miles up the wrong mountain there were 9 children who would hold on to her in the night and do her dishes without being asked and organize woodpiles in her honor. She had not known that there was a man whose idea of comfort was to sit beside you in the dark and say we'll deal with what's next and mean it with his whole plain honest self. She had not known any of it. That was the point. You don't know, standing at the worst moment of a particular road, what's 3 miles up the wrong fork. You just have to keep moving in the rain and trust that the light in a window means something. By summer, the mountain school had 12 students, and Ruth had added Agnes Park's granddaughter to the roster and was writing letters to the Territorial Education Office about formal recognition. By summer, Gideon's herd had recovered, and the accounts had moved from the red into a cautious, workable black. By summer, Daniel had received confirmation from his St. Louis contact that the bar review had resulted in a formal censure of Langford's attorney, and that Langford himself had quietly withdrawn from 2 property ventures in Missouri under circumstances that suggested he was managing his exposure rather than expanding. By summer, Evelyn had begun doing what she had not permitted herself to think about in the hard months. She had begun, carefully, building something beyond the boundaries of one household. It started with a woman named Caroline Mears, who arrived in Harlan's Creek on the August stage with a bag and a story that Evelyn recognized the shape of from the inside. A woman without resources, without options, following a promise that hadn't held up. Mrs. Colton at the dry goods sent her to Ruth, and Ruth brought her up the mountain, and Evelyn sat across the kitchen table from this woman and listened to her the way she wished someone had listened to her in a dirt path 11 months ago. Then she helped. Not in any large or organized way. Not yet. She helped the way you help when you know the terrain someone is standing in, practically and without preamble. She wrote a letter on Caroline's behalf to an arrangement service in Helena that Mrs. Alderman, who had become, over the course of the year, something approaching an ally, had vouched for. She helped Caroline find work with the Pierce family in town while she found her footing. She listened. Caroline was the first. She was not the last. By the end of the summer, there had been 3 others, women who'd landed in Harlan's Creek in various states of having had the ground taken out from under them. And each time the path had run through Ruth and up the mountain and to the kitchen table where Evelyn sat and listened and thought practically about what the next step might be. Gideon said nothing about this. He simply, on one occasion, built a second table for the kitchen without explanation, and on another occasion, when Evelyn had been up very late helping Caroline draft a difficult letter, had set coffee beside her in the dark without a word and gone back to bed. That was the shape of it. That was who they were to each other. Not dramatic, not perfect, not the version of things that looks good from a distance. The version that holds up over time, in ordinary days and difficult ones, in the quiet of 2 people who have decided that the other person's life matters to them and have organized themselves accordingly. She did not know, that summer, whether the thing she was building around the kitchen table would become something formal, something named, something that lasted beyond the immediate need of the women who had come through it. Maybe it would. Ruth was already writing things down. Ruth wrote everything down, and had mentioned, with characteristic matter-of-factness, that there might be a case for a proper organization, a name, a structure, if Evelyn wanted to pursue it. Maybe she would. But she held that lightly, not because she didn't care, but because she'd learned something about the relationship between plans and reality over this past year. You could plan very carefully toward a specific future and arrive at a dirt path being told you were not acceptable. Or you could take the wrong fork in the rain and find yourself 3 miles up a mountain with 9 children and a life you hadn't imagined, and a kitchen table that had become, somehow, the center of something real. She had not chosen this life. She had stumbled into it, wet and humiliated, and $11.40 from nothing, and she had done the next thing and then the next thing, and she had stayed. That was all it had been, in the end. She had stayed. Not because staying was easy. Not because there weren't mornings when the weight of everything felt like more than it should. Not because Gideon didn't sometimes frustrate her with his silences, or James didn't sometimes push past every limit she drew, or the accounts didn't sometimes refuse to balance, no matter how many times she worked through them. She had stayed because the staying meant something. Because there were people here who meant something to her and to whom she meant something, and that was not a small thing to have found. That was, in fact, the thing. The actual thing. Underneath all the other things, the legal fights, and the gossip, and the wrong fork, and the rainstorm, and the whole complicated machinery of how she'd gotten here. She was wanted, not as a function, not as a solution to a particular problem, not as a woman who was acceptable because she met certain specifications, as herself. As Evelyn, stubborn and practical and not pretty in the way that stops people in the street, not quiet when she had something to say, not willing to absorb someone else's shame and carry it as her own, not available to be made small. As herself. On an August evening, she stood at the kitchen window while the mountain went gold in the late light, and Gideon came in from the south pasture, and the children made their usual noise behind her, and May, who was almost 3 now and had developed opinions about everything, demanded to be picked up in a voice that brooked no negotiation. She picked May up. She looked out the window at Gideon coming up the path with the familiar slight stiffness in his right shoulder that meant he'd been working the fence, and she felt the warmth of the kitchen at her back and the solid weight of the child on her hip, and the sound of all those children behind her being exactly, imperfectly, fully themselves. She thought about the woman who had walked away from Caleb Mercer's gate in the rain. That woman had believed in the worst moment of that afternoon that there was nowhere left for her to belong. She had been so wrong. There is a particular thing that happens to people who have been told, for long enough and by enough different voices, that they are not quite enough. They start to agree, not all at once, not with any dramatic moment of surrender, but slowly, in the way water shapes stone. They start to make themselves smaller, to preemptively occupy less space, to expect less and ask for less, and trust less, and hope with the careful. Hedged hope of someone who has learned that hoping too clearly is a way of handing something over to be broken. What Evelyn had discovered, 3 miles up the wrong mountain, was that the agreement was revocable. You could take it back. Not easily, not all at once, not without the kind of fight that cost you things and left marks. But you could take it back. You could stop making yourself small and find out what size you actually were. And if the people around you could not accommodate that size, you could find people who could. They existed. They were out there, living imperfect lives in overcrowded cabins up difficult roads, doing the work of their days, holding things together with consistency and stubbornness and a plain-spoken honesty that didn't ask you to be other than what you were. You just had to stay in the rain long enough to find them. May put her small hand on Evelyn's face, the way she sometimes did, with the complete unself-conscious intimacy of a very small child who had decided that your face was within her jurisdiction. Evelyn turned away from the window. She put her cheek against May's hair and she held the child properly, both arms, not the distracted half-hold of someone doing something else at the same time. She held her, and the kitchen was warm and loud behind her, and Gideon's boots were on the porch steps. The door opened. The mountain evening came in with him for a moment, cool and carrying the smell of pine and turned earth. "Good day?" she asked. "Fence held," he said. Which, for Gideon Walker, was a complete and sufficient answer. She laughed. She didn't laugh the way you do when something is very funny. She laughed the way you do when something is true and you recognize the truth of it and it happens to come with warmth. A small sound, real, not performed. He looked at her over May's head with that expression she knew by now. The one that wasn't quite a smile but was in the territory adjacent to it. The one that meant he was content and was not going to make a production of it. "Dinner's almost ready," she said. "Good," he said, and went to wash his hands. Behind her, James and Joseph had started an argument about something. Clara was telling Hannah something that apparently required a great deal of dramatization. Thomas's careful, quiet footsteps on the stairs meant he was coming down to help set the table, which he did every evening now, without being asked. Ruth appeared from the main room with 2 plates and the look of someone managing 9 variables simultaneously, which she did with a facility that still astonished Evelyn and would astonish her for the rest of her life. The mountain was going dark outside the window. The kitchen was going bright. Evelyn set May down, who immediately went to negotiate with Joseph about something. And she went to the stove and she finished what needed finishing, and she called everyone to the table, and they came. All of them came.